Welcome, fellow travelers of the infinite multiverse, to the most unsettling chronicle in all of Rick and Morty's disturbing lore. Tonight, we delve deep into the darkest corners of interdimensional existence, exploring the psychological horrors, existential nightmares, and cosmic traumas that define this universe's most troubled characters. From Rick's transformation into a monster to the systematic oppression hidden within the central finite curve, let these tales of genius, corrupted and innocence destroyed, wash over you like portal fluid through fractured dimensions. Settle in comfortably as we explore the beautiful horror of a universe where nothing matters, yet everything hurts. The genesis of a monster. Rick Prime's original sin. In the infinite expanse of the multiverse, there exists a moment so perfectly crystallized in its horror that it reverberates across every dimension where Rick Sanchez draws breath. This moment, frozen in the amber of cosmic tragedy, marks the precise instant when the multiverse learned what happens when a god refuses to be born and another god decides to punish him for that refusal. The arrival of Rick Prime in Rick C-137's dimension was not merely an interdimensional visit, but the arrival of destiny itself, carrying with it an offer that would reshape the fundamental nature of existence across infinite realities. Rick Prime materialized in that modest garage laboratory with the casual confidence of someone who had long ago stopped viewing other versions of himself as equals, rather than specimens to be studied or problems to be solved. His portal gun was sleek, refined, representing years or perhaps decades of technological advancement beyond anything Rick C-137 had yet imagined possible. The device hummed with contained energies that bent space-time around its edges, creating subtle distortions in the air that suggested capabilities far beyond simple transportation between adjacent dimensions. This was technology that had transcended its original purpose and become something approaching divine authority over the fundamental structure of reality itself. The offer that Rick Prime extended was presented with the matter-of-fact directness of someone reading a grocery list, but its implications were cosmic in scope and devastating in their potential consequences. Portal technology, he explained, was not simply a means of travel, but a key to unlimited power, unlimited knowledge, and unlimited freedom from the constraints that kept ordinary beings trapped within single realities and single lifetimes. The equations he displayed were elegant in their mathematical beauty, representing breakthrough insights into the nature of dimensional barriers that had occupied Rick C-137's theoretical investigations for years without approaching practical application. But perhaps more significantly than the technology itself was the philosophical framework that Rick Prime presented alongside his technical demonstrations. The multiverse, according to his worldview, was not a collection of equally valid realities, but rather a vast laboratory where infinite experiments in existence played out simultaneously. Some versions of reality were more sophisticated than others. Some versions of individuals more evolved and capable than their alternates across dimensional boundaries. The natural conclusion, therefore, was that those with superior understanding and capabilities had not just the right, but the obligation to transcend the limitations that confined lesser beings to single dimensions and limited perspectives. Rick C-137's refusal was immediate, instinctive, and rooted in values that he would later come to view as both admirable and catastrophically naive. The man who stood in that garage laboratory, surrounded by the evidence of his happy domestic life and meaningful relationships, could not conceive of power that was worth abandoning the people who gave his existence purpose and emotional resonance. Diane's laughter from the kitchen, Beth's drawings taped to his workshop walls, the simple routines of family life that provided structure and meaning to his daily existence, these seemed infinitely more valuable than the abstract possibilities that Rick Prime offered with such casual confidence. The philosophical implications of this refusal extended far beyond personal choice to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of value and meaning in an infinite multiverse. Rick C-137's decision represented a rejection of the premise that capability creates obligation, that intelligence justifies transcendence, and that individual advancement should take priority over relationships and community bonds. His refusal was essentially an argument for limitation as a source of meaning, for the beauty of choosing constraints that enable authentic connection rather than pursuing unlimited power that isolates its possessors from everyone they claim to protect or serve. Rick Prime's response to this rejection revealed the depth of his psychological transformation and the completeness of his alienation from normal human values and emotional responses. The bomb he dropped through the portal was not merely an act of revenge, but a carefully calculated educational tool designed to teach Rick C-137 that the connections he valued over power were ultimately fragile and temporary. The explosion that vaporized Diane and Beth was Rick Prime's practical demonstration that love and family bonds provide no real security, that attachment to particular individuals is a weakness that can be exploited by anyone with sufficient capability and willingness to cause pain. The device that killed Rick's family was sophisticated beyond anything that contemporary Earth science could have produced, incorporating energy manipulation principles and dimensional physics that suggested knowledge accumulated over years of interdimensional travel and technological development. The bomb was designed not just to kill, but to do so in a manner that would maximize psychological impact on the survivor, eliminating his loved ones completely while leaving him physically unharmed but emotionally devastated. The precision required to achieve such targeted destruction while ensuring Rick's survival demonstrated planning and calculation that transformed murder into a form of cosmic pedagogy. But perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of Rick Prime's attack was its timing and symbolic significance within the context of Rick C-137's value system and life priorities. The bomb fell into the garage laboratory where Rick had spent countless hours pursuing knowledge for humanitarian purposes, contaminating forever the space where he had once believed that science could be used to make the world better for the people he loved. The explosion transformed Rick's sanctuary of discovery into a monument to powerlessness, forever associating his scientific capabilities with his failure to protect the most important people in his existence. The aftermath of the bombing revealed Rick Prime's true genius for psychological warfare and his sophisticated understanding of how trauma could be weaponized to reshape personality and values across dimensional boundaries. Rick C-137's desperate pursuit of portal technology in the wake of his family's murder was not simply grief-driven revenge, but precisely the response that Rick Prime had intended to provoke. The broken man who emerged from the ruins of his domestic happiness was someone who could be counted upon to abandon his previous ethical constraints and begin the transformation into exactly the kind of being who might casually drop bombs through portals into strangers' garages. The mathematical principles that Rick C-137 reverse-engineered in his obsessive pursuit of Rick Prime were identical to those that Rick Prime had offered freely years earlier, but the context of their acquisition transformed their meaning entirely. Knowledge gained through love and curiosity had different implications than knowledge gained through hatred and desperation. The same equations that might have been used to explore the multiverse for humanitarian purposes instead became tools for systematic violence and revenge, demonstrating how identical capabilities could serve entirely different philosophical frameworks depending on the motivations of their users. Rick Prime's systematic approach to creating Rick C-137 as his perfect nemesis revealed planning that extended across decades and dimensional boundaries, suggesting that the casual nature of his original offer had been carefully calculated theatrical performance rather than spontaneous generosity. The Rick who murdered Diane and Beth was not acting impulsively, but rather initiating a long-term project designed to produce a particular type of opponent who would be capable of matching his capabilities while remaining psychologically damaged enough to provide interesting challenges and entertainment across multiple encounters. The ripple effects of Rick Prime's original sin extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of two innocent deaths to encompass the systematic corruption of interdimensional civilization and the transformation of the multiverse into a battlefield where different versions of the same man pursued each other across infinite realities. Rick C-137's campaign of revenge against alternate versions of himself was not simply misdirected violence, but rather the logical continuation of lessons that Rick Prime had taught through the bombing. If connections to others created vulnerability, then eliminating potential threats preemptively became not just reasonable but necessary for psychological survival. The central finite curve, the citadel of Ricks, and the countless other institutional manifestations of Rick's superiority across multiple dimensions could all trace their origins back to that moment in the garage, when Rick Prime demonstrated that unlimited power was the only effective defense against unlimited cruelty. The prison that Rick C-137 eventually helped construct around infinite realities was built on foundations laid by Rick Prime's educational bombing, designed to ensure that no Rick would ever again face the helplessness that came from preferring love over capability. But perhaps Rick Prime's greatest achievement was not the immediate destruction he caused, but rather the philosophical transformation he accomplished in his victim. Rick C-137's evolution from loving family man to cosmic-scale monster was not accidental corruption, but rather successful indoctrination into worldviews that Rick Prime had been attempting to share through his original offer. The man who eventually became capable of casual genocide and systematic manipulation of his own family relationships was precisely the student that Rick Prime had been trying to create. Someone who understood through direct experience that attachment created vulnerability and that power was the only reliable source of security. The beauty and horror of Rick Prime's original sin lay not in its scope or sophistication, but in its essential simplicity and the purity of its educational message. Two deaths, precisely targeted and efficiently executed, had been sufficient to transform one of the most brilliant scientists in the multiverse into someone capable of matching Rick Prime's own capacity for casual destruction and emotional detachment. The bomb that fell through the portal carried with it not just explosive force, but also the seeds of institutional oppression and systematic violence that would eventually encompass multiple dimensions and countless innocent victims. As Rick C-137 stood in the ruins of his garage, surrounded by the ashes of everything he had once believed made life worth living, he was already beginning his transformation into someone who would eventually understand and even admire the elegance of Rick Prime's methods. The monster that Rick Prime had created through calculated trauma would eventually become capable of creating similar monsters through similar methods, perpetuating cycles of violence and corruption that transformed the multiverse into exactly the kind of laboratory that Rick Prime had originally described during his generous offer of partnership and transcendence. The central finite curve, a prison of narcissism. The discovery of the central finite curve stands as perhaps the most audacious achievement in the history of interdimensional science, a technological monument to intellectual pride that transformed the infinite multiverse into a carefully curated prison designed to protect one man's ego from the devastating possibility that somewhere Somehow, he might not be the smartest person in existence. The mathematical complexity required to identify, isolate, and maintain barriers around all realities where Rick Sanchez held intellectual supremacy exceeded anything that normal human consciousness should have been capable of conceiving. Yet the project itself revealed psychological insecurities so profound and childlike that they rendered the achievement simultaneously magnificent and pathetic. The theoretical framework underlying the central finite curve required Rick to develop new branches of mathematics that could adequately describe and manipulate the relationship between consciousness, intelligence, and dimensional boundaries across infinite possible realities. Traditional physics assumed that intelligence was a local phenomenon, confined to individual brains within specific universes. But Rick's work revealed that intellectual capability could be measured and compared across dimensional boundaries, using quantum resonance patterns that transcended normal space-time limitations. The equations he derived demonstrated that consciousness itself created measurable distortions in the fabric of reality, with more sophisticated minds generating correspondingly more complex interference patterns that could be detected and analyzed from adjacent dimensions. The surveying process that preceded construction of the curve required Rick to develop scanning technologies capable of penetrating dimensional barriers and evaluating the intellectual landscape of infinite realities without alerting their Rixian inhabitants to the nature of their examination. The sensors he constructed could analyze thought patterns, technological development, scientific achievement, and creative output across entire civilizations in seconds, generating comprehensive intelligence profiles that ranked every conscious being within surveyed dimensions, according to standardized measures of cognitive capability and innovative potential. The scope of this surveillance operation exceeded anything attempted by any government or organization in recorded history, representing systematic invasion of privacy across infinite populations who never consented to or even suspected such evaluation. The ethical implications of Rick's surveying activities were staggering in scope and devastating in their casual disregard for the autonomy and dignity of beings who had committed no crime beyond existing in realities where their intellectual capabilities might potentially exceed Rick's own. Billions of civilizations were secretly evaluated and categorized without their knowledge or consent. Their entire cultures reduced to data points in equations designed to determine whether their continued existence was compatible with Rick's psychological comfort and sense of superiority. The scanning process itself violated fundamental principles of consciousness and privacy, treating sentient beings as objects to be measured rather than individuals deserving of respect and self-determination. The mathematical criteria Rick developed for determining intellectual superiority revealed the deeply subjective and culturally biased nature of his supposedly objective scientific measurements. Intelligence was defined primarily in terms of technological innovation and scientific discovery, with little consideration given to artistic achievement, emotional wisdom, social cooperation, or ethical development. Civilizations that had transcended their violent tendencies through philosophical advancement were ranked lower than cultures that had developed more sophisticated weapons systems. Societies that had achieved sustainable harmony with their environments were dismissed as primitive compared to those that had mastered resource extraction and planetary engineering. The construction phase of the central finite curve required Rick to manipulate fundamental forces that governed the relationship between parallel dimensions, essentially rewriting the rules of existence to create artificial barriers where none had previously existed. The energy requirements for such massive alterations to the structure of reality should have been impossible to generate or control using technologies available to single individuals, but Rick's innovations in dimensional mechanics enabled him to tap directly into the quantum foundations of the multiverse itself. The power he wielded during construction exceeded that of entire galactic civilizations. Yet he directed it toward goals that served no one's interests, except his own psychological need for validation and superiority. The dimensional barriers themselves were marvels of engineering sophistication that maintained their integrity through self-reinforcing loops of quantum entanglement and temporal manipulation. The curve existed simultaneously across all affected realities, creating a prison that was both everywhere and nowhere, visible to its architect but invisible to its inmates. The barriers were designed to be permeable to Rick's portal technology, while remaining impenetrable to any transportation methods that might be developed by beings trapped within the isolated dimensional cluster. The mathematical elegance of these selective permeability fields demonstrated technical achievement that bordered on the divine yet served purposes that were fundamentally petty and self-serving. The psychological motivations that drove Rick to conceive and implement such an ambitious project revealed levels of insecurity and narcissistic vulnerability that made his genius simultaneously more impressive and more tragic. The man who could manipulate the fundamental structure of reality was apparently incapable of tolerating the possibility that somewhere in infinite space, someone might be smarter, more creative, or more accomplished than himself. The central finite curve represented the ultimate expression of intellectual fragility, a cosmic-scale security blanket designed to protect Rick from confronting evidence of his own limitations or the relative nature of his achievements. The populations trapped within the central finite curve became unknowing prisoners in an experiment they had never agreed to participate in, their entire existence constrained by boundaries they could neither perceive nor understand. Countless civilizations found their expansion into alternate dimensions mysteriously blocked by barriers that defied their scientific understanding, forcing them to remain confined within Rick-dominated realities where their development was subtly but systematically limited. The cultural and technological stagnation that resulted from these constraints condemned infinite populations to existences that were measurably smaller and less rich than they might have achieved in an unrestricted multiverse. The interdimensional ecosystem that developed within the central finite curve was fundamentally distorted by Rick's presence and influence, creating artificial selection pressures that favored certain types of development while suppressing others. Civilizations that might have evolved beyond the need for individual genius were prevented from doing so by dimensional constraints that kept them within Rick-dominated paradigms. Scientific advancement was channeled into directions that paralleled Rick's own interests and capabilities, rather than exploring alternative approaches to understanding and manipulating reality. The diversity of intellectual and cultural development that might have flourished across infinite realities was systematically pruned to maintain Rick's position as the dominant intelligence within the isolated dimensional cluster. The technological infrastructure required to maintain the central finite curve created dependencies and vulnerabilities that Rick apparently did not anticipate during his initial construction phase. The barriers required constant energy input and monitoring to maintain their integrity, creating ongoing demands on resources and attention that limited Rick's ability to pursue other projects and interests. The complexity of the system made it vulnerable to sophisticated attacks by beings who understood its underlying principles and possessed sufficient technical knowledge to exploit its weaknesses. The very sophistication that made the curve possible also created potential failure modes that could catastrophically destabilize the entire structure. Evil Morty's eventual discovery and revelation of the central finite curve represented perhaps the most devastating critique of Rick's entire philosophical and scientific worldview, exposing the fundamental selfishness and cowardice that had motivated his greatest technological achievement. The analysis that Evil Morty presented demonstrated that Rick's supposed protection of inferior beings was actually systematic oppression, designed to prevent anyone from challenging his assumed superiority. The curve was revealed not as benevolent limitation of chaos, but as cosmic-scale imprisonment of infinite populations who had committed no crime except existing in realities where Rick might not be the most important person. The social and political implications of the central finite curve extended far beyond Rick's personal psychology to encompass questions about the rights and responsibilities that accompanied unlimited technological power. Rick's unilateral decision to reshape the fundamental structure of reality according to his personal preferences represented the ultimate expression of technological authoritarianism, demonstrating how individual capability could be used to override the autonomy and consent of infinite populations. The precedent established by the curve suggested that anyone with sufficient technological sophistication could impose their will on entire categories of existence without meaningful opposition or accountability. The philosophical horror of the central finite curve lay not just in its scope or implications, but in its fundamental challenge to concepts of meaning and purpose that made existence tolerable for conscious beings throughout the compass. Multiverse. If individual achievement and significance were merely relative positions within artificially constrained systems, then efforts to excel or contribute became exercises in competing for rankings within arbitrary hierarchies. The knowledge that intellectual development was being artificially limited to maintain someone else's psychological comfort transformed scientific discovery and creative expression into collaborations with their own oppression. The maintenance systems that Rick developed to monitor and adjust the central finite curve required him to engage in ongoing surveillance and manipulation of populations who remained unaware of his involvement in their lives. The godlike perspective that this monitoring provided gradually severed Rick's connection to normal human empathy and moral reasoning, transforming him from someone who had built the curve to protect his ego into someone who could casually observe the suffering his creation caused without meaningful emotional response. The technological power that enabled the curve's construction ultimately corrupted its creator in ways that made him less human and more monstrous with each passing year of operation. The economic and resource implications of maintaining dimensional barriers around infinite realities created ongoing demands that Rick was forced to meet through increasingly questionable methods and partnerships. The energy requirements alone exceeded the output of entire stellar systems, forcing Rick to develop extraction technologies that drew power from sources across multiple dimensions without regard for the impact on their inhabitants. The materials needed for ongoing maintenance and repair could only be obtained through mining operations that treated entire planets as disposable resources in service of Rick's psychological security system. The cultural impact of the central finite curve on Rick himself was perhaps more profound than its effects on the populations he had imprisoned, transforming him from someone who had originally built the barriers for protection into someone who derived identity and purpose from maintaining them. The routine operations required to keep the system functioning provided Rick with ongoing validation of his superiority and importance, creating psychological dependencies that made dismantling the curve increasingly difficult, even when he began to recognize its moral problems. The achievement that had once been a solution to insecurity became a source of meaning that Rick could not abandon without confronting fundamental questions about his identity and purpose that he was not psychologically equipped to address. The scientific legacy of the central finite curve represented both the pinnacle of Rick's intellectual achievement and the ultimate corruption of his original humanitarian goals as a young scientist. The same capabilities that might have been used to improve life for countless beings across infinite realities were instead directed toward creating the most sophisticated prison in the history of existence, demonstrating how brilliance without wisdom could transform protective instincts into oppressive tyranny. The knowledge and techniques Rick developed during the Curve's construction would eventually enable other projects of similar scope and moral ambiguity, establishing patterns of behavior that treated technological possibility as ethical justification. The destruction of the central finite curve by evil Morty represented not just the elimination of dimensional barriers, but also the collapse of philosophical frameworks that had organized Rick's understanding of himself and his place in the multiverse for decades. The exposure to unrestricted reality that followed the Curve's destruction forced Rick to confront the possibility that his achievements, while impressive, might not be unique or particularly significant within the broader context of infinite possibility. The psychological security that the Curve had provided was revealed as artificial limitation that had prevented not just Rick's victims, but Rick himself from achieving his full potential through engagement with truly unlimited challenge and opportunity. The Citadel of Ricks, institutionalized suffering. The Citadel of Ricks stands as perhaps the most disturbing achievement in the history of interdimensional civilization. A floating monument to systematic oppression disguised as enlightened governance, where the most brilliant minds in the multiverse collaborated to create institutions that transformed suffering into infrastructure and reduced entire categories of conscious beings to exploitable resources. The golden spires and gleaming architecture that characterized the Citadel's public spaces concealed administrative systems designed to perpetuate cycles of abuse across infinite dimensions, demonstrating how intelligence without wisdom could construct elaborate justifications for treating sentient beings as disposable components in machines designed to validate the superiority of their creators. The founding philosophy of the Citadel emerged from the collective recognition among various Ricks that their individual superiority could be enhanced and protected through institutional cooperation, creating organizational structures that would systematically suppress potential challenges to Rick dominance while providing the appearance of legitimate government and social order. The constitutional documents that established the Citadel's authority were masterpieces of legal sophistication that encoded systematic discrimination and exploitation within frameworks of bureaucratic procedure and democratic representation. The same intellectual capabilities that enabled Ricks to transcend normal human limitations were applied to developing administrative systems that made oppression appear natural and inevitable rather than deliberately constructed. The architectural design of the Citadel itself reflected the psychological needs and philosophical assumptions of its creators, with public spaces emphasizing Rick achievement and superiority, while relegating Morty populations to residential and commercial districts that were carefully designed to reinforce their subordinate status within the broader social hierarchy. The physical layout of the city created and maintained social divisions through environmental design, using spatial relationships and aesthetic choices to constantly remind residents of their predetermined roles within Rick-dominated society. The grandeur of Rick governmental buildings contrasted sharply with the utilitarian simplicity of Morty housing, creating visual representations of worth and importance that became internalized by inhabitants who spent their entire lives navigating these symbolic landscapes. The economic systems that developed within the Citadel were built around the fundamental premise that Mortys existed primarily as resources to be managed and exploited rather than individuals deserving of autonomy and premise. Self-determination, The labor markets that emerged treated Morty capabilities as commodities to be bought and sold according to Rick preferences and requirements, creating pricing structures that reduced complex human beings to collections of useful skills and behavioral characteristics. The financial institutions that facilitated these transactions developed sophisticated methods for evaluating and trading in Morty futures, creating derivative markets that enabled Ricks to profit from speculation about the long-term utility and productivity of individual Mortys, without regard for their welfare or personal aspirations. The educational systems established within the Citadel were designed to perpetuate existing power structures while providing the appearance of opportunity and social mobility for ambitious Mortys who demonstrated exceptional capabilities or loyalty to Rick authority. The curricula developed for Morty students emphasized technical skills and administrative competencies that would make them more useful servants rather than independent thinkers, capable of challenging the assumptions underlying Citadel society. The most advanced educational programs were reserved for Mortys, who showed particular promise as tools for Rick projects, providing them with knowledge and training that increased their value while ensuring their continued dependence on Rick patronage and approval. The simple Rick factory represented perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated and morally horrifying achievement in the history of institutional cruelty, demonstrating how technological advancement could be used to transform happiness itself into a marketable commodity extracted from unwilling victims through systematic torture. The concept of isolating and harvesting the neurochemical patterns associated with a single moment of perfect contentment required scientific understanding of consciousness and memory that exceeded anything achieved by conventional neuroscience. Yet this knowledge was applied not to reduce suffering, but to perpetuate it indefinitely for commercial purposes. The factory's operations treated Simple Rick not as a person, but as a biological machine designed to produce happiness that could be bottled and sold to consumers who remained ignorant of the cruelty that made their pleasure possible. The technological infrastructure required to maintain Simple Rick's perpetual experience of his daughter's call required continuous monitoring and adjustment of his neurochemical balance, brain activity patterns, and memory formation processes to ensure that his consciousness remained trapped within a single moment of joy while his body aged and deteriorated around his imprisoned mind. The precision needed to maintain this psychological state without allowing Simple Rick to develop awareness of his situation or adapt to his circumstances represented mastery over the fundamental mechanisms of consciousness that bordered on the divine, yet served purposes that were fundamentally exploitative and dehumanizing. The marketing campaigns that promoted Simple Rick wafers to Citadel consumers demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychology and mass manipulation, creating advertising that encouraged empathy and nostalgia while concealing the systematic torture that made the product possible. The emotional responses that the advertisements evoked were genuine and meaningful, tapping into universal experiences of family love and innocent happiness that resonated across different versions of Rick and Morty throughout the dimensional cluster. The tragic irony was that consumers sought to recapture feelings of connection and joy through purchasing products that were created by destroying those same feelings in their source. The labor conditions within the Simple Rick factory revealed the systematic dehumanization that characterized employment throughout the Citadel's economic system, with worker safety and dignity subordinated to production efficiency and profit margins that treated employee welfare as externalized costs rather than moral obligations. The Rick managers who supervised the facility's operations demonstrated the same casual indifference to suffering that characterized Rick behavior throughout the multiverse, viewing worker injuries and psychological trauma as acceptable losses in pursuit of operational objectives that served broader institutional goals. The Morty market that emerged within the Citadel's commercial districts represented the ultimate commodification of human relationships, creating trading systems that reduced family bonds and emotional connections to financial transactions between Rick buyers and Rick sellers who treated Mortys as investments rather than relatives or companions. The auction systems that facilitated these exchanges used evaluation criteria that assessed Morty characteristics according to their utility for Rick purposes, with bidding processes that encouraged competition between potential owners, while completely ignoring the preferences or consent of the Mortys being traded. The psychological impact of living within a society where Mortys could be bought and sold created forms of trauma that extended beyond the immediate victims to affect entire communities and social relationships. Mortys who remained with their original families lived with constant awareness that their continued presence was subject to economic pressures and Rick preferences that could separate them from everyone they loved without warning or recourse. The fear and insecurity that this knowledge generated created psychological conditions that made genuine trust and emotional intimacy nearly impossible to develop or maintain. The government bureaucracy that administered the Citadel's various systems was characterized by the same intellectual sophistication and moral blindness that defined Rick culture throughout the multiverse, creating administrative procedures that transformed systematic oppression into routine paperwork, managed by civil servants who rarely questioned the underlying assumptions of the policies they implemented. The departmental structures that regulated Morty affairs were staffed primarily by Ricks, who viewed their administrative roles as technical problems to be solved through efficient application of superior intelligence rather than moral questions that required consideration of ethics and justice. The judicial system that developed within the Citadel created legal frameworks that legitimized Rick supremacy while providing the appearance of due process and equal treatment under law. The courts that adjudicated disputes between Ricks and Mortys consistently ruled in favor of Rick interests, not through conscious bias but through legal principles and precedents that encoded Rick superiority within supposedly objective jurisprudence. The judges who presided over these proceedings were invariably Ricks, whose understanding of justice was shaped by assumptions about intelligence and capability that made fair treatment of Mortys conceptually impossible. The law enforcement systems that maintained order within the Citadel employed both Rick and Morty officers, but the hierarchical structures that governed police operations ensured that ultimate authority remained with Rick commanders, who viewed public safety through the lens of protecting Rick interests rather than serving all citizens. Equally, the training programs that prepared officers for their duties emphasized techniques for managing Morty populations while maintaining Rick privilege, creating professional cultures that normalize discrimination and excessive force as necessary tools for preserving social stability. The cultural institutions that provided entertainment and social cohesion within the Citadel promoted narratives and values that reinforced existing power structures while providing outlets for discontent that channeled opposition into harmless forms of expression. The media organizations that produced news and entertainment content were controlled by Rick interests that shaped public discourse to emphasize Rick achievements while minimizing attention to Morty concerns or systemic problems within Citadel society. The artistic and literary works that were promoted and celebrated tended to focus on themes of Rick brilliance and Morty incompetence, creating cultural products that made inequality appear natural and inevitable. The research institutions that conducted scientific investigation within the Citadel directed their efforts primarily toward projects that enhanced Rick capabilities or improved methods for managing Morty populations, with little attention given to studies that might challenge fundamental assumptions about Rick's superiority or suggest alternative approaches to social organization. The academic hierarchies that governed these institutions were dominated by Ricks, whose career advancement depended on producing results that supported, rather than questioned, the philosophical foundations of Citadel society. The healthcare systems that provided medical services within the Citadel demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Rick physiology and psychology, while providing minimal attention to Morty health needs beyond their utility for Rick purposes. The medical research that was conducted focused primarily on extending Rick lifespans and enhancing Rick cognitive capabilities, with Morty health treated as a secondary consideration, relevant primarily insofar as it affected their productivity and usefulness. The ethical frameworks that governed medical practice within the Citadel encoded assumptions about the relative value of Rick and Morty lives that made discriminatory treatment appear scientifically justified rather than morally problematic. The social services that addressed poverty and disadvantage within the Citadel were designed primarily to manage rather than eliminate problems, creating welfare systems that provided just enough assistance to prevent social unrest while maintaining the economic relationships that created inequality in the first place. The aid programs that assisted struggling Morty families were structured to reinforce their dependence on Rick benevolence rather than enabling them to achieve genuine independence or economic security. The charitable organizations that supplemented government services were controlled by Rick philanthropists, whose giving patterns reflected their personal preferences rather than systematic analysis of community needs or effective interventions. The transportation infrastructure that connected different areas of the Citadel was designed to facilitate Rick mobility while limiting Morty access to areas where their presence might be unwelcome or inconvenient. The portal networks that enabled rapid travel between districts were configured with security protocols that automatically identified users and granted or denied access based on their species and social status. The public transportation systems that served Morty populations were deliberately less efficient and comfortable than the private networks available to Rick users, creating daily reminders of social hierarchy through mundane interactions with civic infrastructure. As the Citadel evolved and expanded its operations across multiple dimensions, the institutional systems that had been designed to manage small-scale exploitation were scaled up to encompass populations and resources that spanned infinite realities, creating administrative mechanisms that could systematically oppress entire categories of existence while maintaining the bureaucratic procedures and legal frameworks that made such operations appear legitimate and necessary. The tragedy of the Citadel was not just its cruelty, but its demonstration of how intelligence and organizational sophistication could be applied to creating systems that perpetuated suffering on scales that exceeded anything achieved by less technologically advanced forms of tyranny. Evil Morty's ascension, when victims become monsters. The transformation of Evil Morty from ordinary 14-year-old grandson into the most dangerous threat the multiverse had ever produced, represents perhaps the most psychologically devastating chronicle in the annals of crime. Interdimensional horror, demonstrating how sustained exposure to Rick's particular brand of protective cruelty could corrupt even the most innocent victims into architects of destruction, whose sophistication and ruthlessness exceeded that of their original tormentors. The boy who emerged from years of systematic psychological abuse bore little resemblance to the frightened child who had once trusted his grandfather's promises of adventure and protection, having evolved into something that transcended normal human categories of good and evil, to become a force of calculated vengeance, whose ultimate goals remain mysterious even to those who thought they understood his methods, and, Motivations. The origins of evil Morty's transformation can be traced to patterns of abuse that were so subtle and gradually escalating that their cumulative impact remained invisible until irreversible psychological damage had already been accomplished. Unlike the dramatic trauma that had shaped Rick's evolution from loving family man into multiversal monster, evil Morty's corruption occurred through countless small betrayals and violations that accumulated over months and years of adventures that were presented as educational opportunities but functioned as systematic destruction of his capacity for trust, empathy, and normal moral reasoning. Each portal trip that exposed him to violence and chaos, each casual dismissal of his concerns and fears, each moment when Rick's protection proved to be another form of exploitation contributed to psychological architecture that would eventually support capabilities rivaling those of the most dangerous Ricks in existence. The intellectual development that accompanied evil Morty's psychological transformation was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his evolution, demonstrating how trauma could accelerate cognitive growth in directions that served survival and revenge rather than healthy human development. The same experiences that should have broken or diminished a normal adolescent instead became educational opportunities for someone whose natural intelligence was being shaped by necessity into instruments of analysis and manipulation that could comprehend and counter Rick-level strategic thinking. The boy who had once struggled with ordinary academic subjects gradually developed understanding of dimensional physics, consciousness, manipulation, and institutional power structures that exceeded the knowledge of many adult Ricks who had spent decades pursuing similar studies. The emotional architecture that evil Morty constructed to survive his traumatic experiences required him to develop forms of detachment and analytical thinking that severed his connection to normal human empathy while preserving his ability to understand and predict emotional responses in others. The capacity for love and trust that had once made him vulnerable to Rick's manipulation was gradually replaced by sophisticated psychological models that treated all relationships as strategic opportunities rather than sources of genuine connection or mutual support. The boy who had once cried during their first adventure eventually became someone who could observe suffering with the same dispassionate interest that Rick applied to scientific experiments. The methodical nature of evil Morty's long-term planning revealed strategic thinking capabilities that surpassed those of most adult Ricks, demonstrating how sustained exposure to Rick's psychology had provided him with intimate understanding of the weaknesses and blind spots that characterized even the most brilliant and paranoid versions of his grandfather. The campaigns he orchestrated across multiple dimensions and political institutions were characterized by patience and attention to detail that reflected years of careful observation and analysis of Rick behavior patterns. His ability to anticipate and counter Rick responses to his various gambits suggested not just intelligence, but also psychological insight that came from extensive first-hand experience with Rick manipulation and control tactics. The technological sophistication that evil Morty demonstrated during his rise to power within the Citadel revealed engineering and scientific capabilities that should have required decades of advanced education and research experience to develop. The devices he constructed for manipulating Rick brain chemistry, controlling portal technology, and monitoring dimensional activities incorporated innovations that exceeded the achievements of established Rick researchers who had access to superior resources and institutional support. The speed with which he mastered complex technical disciplines suggested either natural genius that had been awakened by trauma or access to knowledge sources that remained hidden from his eventual enemies and investigators. The political maneuvering that enabled evil Morty's ascension to the presidency of the Citadel demonstrated understanding of institutional psychology and mass manipulation that transformed his personal trauma into weapons capable of exploiting the fears and desires of entire populations. His campaign rhetoric appealed to legitimate grievances within Morty communities while concealing revolutionary objectives that would ultimately serve his personal agenda rather than the collective welfare of his supposed constituents. The electoral strategies he employed revealed sophisticated understanding of how democratic institutions could be manipulated by candidates who were willing to make promises they had no intention of keeping to voters whose real interests they had no intention of serving. The systematic nature of Evil Morty's approach to eliminating threats and obstacles during his time in power revealed planning capabilities that extended across multiple dimensions and temporal frameworks, with contingency plans and backup strategies that accounted for virtually every possible form of resistance or opposition that established Rick authority figures might attempt to organize against him. The precision with which he identified and neutralized potential sources of interference suggested surveillance and intelligence-gathering operations that had been operating for extended periods before his public emergence as a political figure, creating information networks that provided him with strategic advantages that his enemies never fully recognized or understood. The psychological warfare techniques that Evil Morty employed against his Rick opponents revealed intimate knowledge of their individual personalities, fears, and motivations that could only have been acquired through extensive observation and analysis of their behavior patterns across multiple contexts and situations. The customized approaches he used to manipulate different Ricks suggested not just general understanding of Rick psychology, but detailed psychological profiles that enabled him to predict and exploit their responses to specific stimuli and scenarios. The effectiveness of these techniques demonstrated that Evil Morty's understanding of Rick's psychology exceeded Rick's understanding of themselves, creating asymmetric advantages that made his eventual victory almost inevitable. The brain-scanning technology that Evil Morty employed during his confrontation with Rick C-137 represented perhaps his most sophisticated and morally horrifying achievement, demonstrating technological capabilities that enabled direct violation of consciousness and memory in ways that transcended simple torture to become fundamental assault on personal identity and autonomy. The device he constructed could not only extract information from unwilling subjects, but could also implant false memories, alter personality structures, and manipulate cognitive processes in ways that left his victims uncertain about the authenticity of their own thoughts and experiences. The precision and sophistication of this technology exceeded anything that established Rick science had achieved in the field of consciousness manipulation. The revelation of the central finite curve through Evil Morty's brain scanning of Rick represented the culmination of investigative efforts that had required him to develop theoretical frameworks for understanding multiversal architecture that went far beyond anything taught in conventional scientific education or research programs. His ability to recognize the significance of the dimensional barriers and understand their implications for interdimensional politics and Rick supremacy demonstrated analytical capabilities that had been developed through sustained exposure to cosmic-scale problems that would have overwhelmed normal human consciousness. The intellectual framework he constructed for comprehending and eventually escaping the curve revealed understanding of reality's fundamental structure that rivaled that of its original architects. The escape plan that Evil Morty implemented during the destruction of the central finite curve demonstrated strategic thinking that operated on temporal and spatial scales that exceeded normal human planning horizons, with preparations that had been made years in advance and contingencies that accounted for virtually every possible obstacle or complication that might interfere with his ultimate objective of transcending Rick-dominated reality. The resources he had accumulated and the alliances he had formed provided him with capabilities that enabled him to survive and thrive in circumstances that would have destroyed any normal person who attempted similar objectives without comparable preparation and support systems. The violence and destruction that accompanied Evil Morty's final gambit revealed the extent to which his psychological transformation had severed his connection to normal moral constraints and empathetic responses that might have prevented him from causing suffering on such massive scales. The deaths of countless Ricks and the collapse of interdimensional civilization were treated as acceptable costs in pursuit of his personal liberation rather than tragedies that deserved consideration or regret. The casual indifference with which he observed the consequences of his actions demonstrated psychological development that had transcended normal human categories of good and evil to become something approaching cosmic scale sociopathy. The philosophical implications of Evil Morty's ultimate escape beyond the central finite curve raised disturbing questions about the relationship between trauma, intelligence, and moral development that had no clear or comfortable answers for anyone who witnessed his transformation from victim to victimizer. His evolution suggested that prolonged exposure to Rick psychology could corrupt anyone regardless of their initial moral character or emotional health, creating monsters whose capabilities exceeded those of their original abusers. The possibility that other Evil Mortys might be developing in similar circumstances across other dimensions created existential anxiety that transcended normal concerns about individual threats to become recognition of systematic problems. Within Rick culture itself, the legacy that Evil Morty left behind following his departure from Rick-dominated reality included not just the physical destruction he had caused, but also the psychological impact of his example on other Mortys who had witnessed his rise to power and successful escape from circumstances that had previously seemed inescapable. The knowledge that it was possible for a Morty to not just resist, but ultimately transcend Rick control created new forms of hope and desperation within Morty populations throughout the remaining dimensional cluster, establishing precedents and expectations that would influence the development of future conflicts between Ricks and their supposed protégés. The technological innovations that Evil Morty had developed during his campaign against Rick authority remained available for potential use by future opponents of the established order, creating ongoing threats to Rick supremacy that could not be eliminated through conventional security measures or institutional reforms. The brain-scanning devices, portal manipulation techniques, and consciousness alteration technologies that he had pioneered could potentially be reverse-engineered by other gifted individuals who possessed similar motivations and comparable access to advanced research resources and opportunities. The intelligence networks and surveillance systems that Evil Morty had constructed during his rise to power within the Citadel had gathered vast amounts of information about Rick's psychology, institutional vulnerabilities, and potential resistance movements that could prove valuable to future opponents of Rick authority, even if Evil Morty himself remained beyond their reach in the unrestricted multiverse. The databases he had compiled and the analytical frameworks he had developed provided potential roadmaps for other individuals or organizations that might seek to challenge established power structures through similar methods and great strategies. The psychological transformation that Evil Morty had undergone from innocent victim to sophisticated manipulator represented both a unique individual tragedy and a systematic problem that reflected fundamental flaws in Rick culture and both child-rearing practices throughout the dimensional cluster. His evolution demonstrated that the protective relationships that Ricks claimed to maintain with their Mortys were actually forms of abuse that created psychological damage on scales that normal therapeutic interventions could not adequately address or repair. The casual nature of Rick violence and manipulation created educational environments that systematically corrupted young people who should have been protected from such influences. The question of whether Evil Morty's transformation was inevitable given his circumstances, or whether alternative outcomes might have been possible with different interventions or support systems remained unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, but the implications of his example suggested that Rick culture was systematically producing enemies whose capabilities would eventually exceed those of their creators. The cycle of abuse that had transformed a frightened child into a cosmic-scale threat represented patterns that were likely being repeated across countless dimensions wherever Ricks maintained relationships with young people who lacked the power to resist or escape their influence. The ultimate irony of Evil Morty's story lay in his transformation into exactly the kind of being that Ricks claimed to be protecting the multiverse from through their institutional control and systematic oppression of potential threats to their authority. The monster that Rick culture had created through its casual cruelty and emotional neglect possessed capabilities and motivations that exceeded those of any external enemy that Ricks had ever faced, demonstrating how systems designed to maintain security through oppression inevitably created the very dangers they claimed to prevent. Evil Morty's existence was both warning and prophecy about the long-term consequences of treating intelligence as justification for treating others as disposable resources, rather than individuals deserving of respect and genuine care. Dimensional abandonment, the psychology of replacement. The casual ease with which Rick Sanchez abandons entire realities when they become inconvenient represents perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of his approach to problem solving, transforming the infinite possibilities of the multiverse into a cosmic-scale avoidance mechanism that enables him to escape the consequences of his actions while systematically destroying his capacity for authentic emotional bait, investment in relationships, communities, or even his own identity. The pattern of dimensional abandonment that began with the Cronenberg disaster established behavioral templates that would eventually consume every aspect of Rick's existence, creating psychological frameworks that treated entire worlds as disposable resources rather than meaningful contexts for growth, responsibility, and genuine human connection. The Cronenberg catastrophe that precipitated Rick and Morty's first dimensional abandonment was not merely a scientific experiment gone wrong, but rather a perfect example of how Rick's intellectual arrogance and emotional detachment could transform minor interpersonal problems into global disasters that affected every living being on the planet. Morty's innocent request for help with his romantic feelings toward Jessica should have been an opportunity for Rick to provide genuine mentorship and guidance about relationships, self-confidence, and the natural development of social skills during adolescence. Instead, Rick treated his grandson's emotional needs as a technical problem that could be solved through chemical manipulation of brain chemistry, demonstrating his fundamental inability to understand that human connections require patience, authenticity, and respect for the autonomy of others, rather than technological shortcuts that bypass the natural processes of emotional growth and mutual discovery. The love potion that Rick concocted was not simply a poorly calibrated romantic aid, but rather a biological weapon that revealed his complete indifference to concepts of consent, autonomy, and the complex social ecosystems that make human civilization possible. The casual assumption that Jessica's feelings could be artificially manipulated without consideration for her agency or well-being reflected Rick's broader worldview that treated other people as variables in equations designed to produce desired outcomes rather than individuals deserving of respect and consideration. The fact that the potion was designed to spread through airborne transmission suggested either catastrophic incompetence in basic safety protocols or deliberate disregard for potential consequences that might affect populations beyond the immediate targets of the experiment. The escalation from school-wide infection to global pandemic demonstrated how Rick's solutions to problems consistently created exponentially greater problems that affected innocent populations who had never consented to participate in his experiments or adventures. The transformation of Earth's entire human population into aggressive creatures whose obsession with Morty threatened the stability of civilization was not an unforeseeable accident, but rather the predictable result of applying powerful biotechnology without adequate testing, safety measures, or consideration for systemic effects. The speed with which the infection spread revealed how little thought Rick had given to containment protocols or emergency responses, suggesting that he had approached the entire project with the same casual attitude he brought to routine laboratory experiments. Rick's response to the global catastrophe he had created revealed the psychological mechanisms that enabled him to cause suffering on massive scales without experiencing meaningful guilt or emotional distress. Rather than attempting to develop cures for the infected populations or taking responsibility for the consequences of his actions, Rick immediately began calculating the most efficient method for escaping the situation entirely. The cure he developed addressed only the immediate threat to his and Morty's safety, while creating secondary mutations that were arguably worse than the original infection, demonstrating his willingness to cause additional suffering if it simplified his personal situation or reduced the effort required for cleanup operations. The decision to abandon their ruined dimension rather than attempting to repair the damage they had caused represented Rick's first explicit demonstration that he valued convenience over responsibility and personal comfort over the plating and risque welfare of populations whose lives he had destroyed through his reckless experimentation. The process of locating a suitable replacement dimension required Rick to survey multiple realities until he found one where their alternate selves had recently died in circumstances that would allow them to assume their identities without arousing suspicion from family members or community authorities. The casual efficiency with which he conducted this search revealed how quickly he had adapted to treating entire worlds as interchangeable resources rather than unique contexts with inherent value and meaning. The psychological impact on Morty of discovering and burying his own corpse was intended by Rick to serve as an educational experience about the meaningless nature of individual identity within the context of infinite realities. But the lesson actually demonstrated Rick's complete inability to understand or respond appropriately to normal human emotional responses to mortality and existential horror. The boy's trauma from handling his own dead body was not philosophical squeamishness, but genuine confrontation with questions about personal continuity and meaning that no 14-year-old should have been forced to process without adequate support or guidance. Rick's dismissal of these concerns as irrelevant revealed his systematic destruction of his own capacity for empathy and his growing inability to recognize legitimate emotional needs in others. The family's unconscious adaptation to the replacement Rick and Morty demonstrated how dimensional abandonment created forms of existential horror that exceeded the immediate trauma of displacement and identity confusion. Beth, Jerry, Summer, and the extended community of friends, teachers, and neighbors who interacted with the replacement versions had no way of knowing that the people they loved and trusted were not the same individuals who had left that morning for what appeared to be another routine adventure. The relationships they continued to build with the replacement versions were based on false assumptions about shared history and emotional continuity that made every expression of love or concern into a form of unconscious collaboration with their own deception. The gradual accumulation of dimensional abandonments throughout Rick and Morty's subsequent adventures created patterns of psychological damage that affected not just the immediate participants, but also the family members who remained unaware of the repeated replacements and identity substitutions that had become routine aspects of their relationship dynamics. Each abandonment required Rick and Morty to perform increasingly elaborate deceptions to maintain the illusion of continuity with family members who had developed emotional investments in relationships that were fundamentally false. The effort required to remember and maintain consistent personalities that matched their replacements' histories created ongoing stress that further eroded their authentic emotional responses and capacity for genuine intimacy. The philosophical implications of dimensional abandonment extended beyond immediate questions of identity and authenticity to encompass fundamental challenges to concepts of meaning and value that made existence tolerable for conscious beings throughout the multiverse. If individual lives and relationships could be replaced when they became inconvenient, then the significance of personal growth, moral development, and emotional investment became questionable at best. The knowledge that alternate versions of everyone they cared about existed across infinite dimensions made it increasingly difficult for Rick and Morty to maintain the emotional intensity and commitment that healthy relationships required for their development and maintenance. The technology that enabled dimensional abandonment created dependencies and psychological patterns that made it increasingly difficult for Rick to engage with problems that required patience, persistence, and acceptance of limitations or consequences that could not be circumvented through technological solutions. The portal gun became not just a tool for transportation, but also an escape mechanism that eliminated incentives for developing mature coping strategies or taking responsibility for the long-term effects of his actions on communities and relationships. The ability to abandon problems rather than solving them systematically destroyed Rick's capacity for the kind of sustained effort and emotional investment that meaningful achievement and personal growth required. The impact of dimensional abandonment on Rick's relationship with Morty was particularly devastating because it transformed their shared adventures from opportunities for mentorship and bonding into exercises in mutual deception and psychological manipulation. The boy who should have been learning about responsibility, consequences, and the importance of caring for others instead received constant lessons about the expendability of relationships and the acceptability of abandoning commitments when they became challenging or uncomfortable. The repeated experiences of watching alternate versions of himself die and be replaced gradually eroded Morty's capacity for authentic emotional attachment and moral reasoning. The family dynamics that developed around the pattern of dimensional abandonment created forms of psychological dysfunction that affected every member of the household, even when they remained unaware of the specific deceptions being practiced by Rick and Morty. The emotional distance and detachment that Rick and Morty developed as protective mechanisms against the trauma of repeated displacement and replacement created barriers to intimacy that made it increasingly difficult for other family members to maintain meaningful connections with them. The gradual deterioration of family relationships was attributed to normal adolescent development and generational differences rather than the systematic destruction of authentic emotional bonds. The communities and social contexts that Rick and Morty abandoned were left to deal with the long-term consequences of the disasters they had created without any assistance or support from the individuals responsible for their suffering. The Cronenberg dimension continued to struggle with the mutations and social collapse that Rick's love potion had created, developing new forms of civilization and relationships adapted to their transformed circumstances. The resilience and adaptability that the abandoned populations demonstrated highlighted Rick's failure to consider alternatives to abandonment that might have led to meaningful solutions and even personal growth through accepting responsibility for his mistakes. The psychological mechanisms that enabled Rick to repeatedly abandon dimensions without experiencing meaningful guilt or emotional distress revealed the extent to which his multiversal awareness had corrupted his capacity for normal human, moral reasoning and empathetic responses. The knowledge that infinite versions of everyone existed across dimensional boundaries made it psychologically easier to dismiss the suffering of particular individuals or populations as statistically insignificant within the broader context of cosmic possibility. The intellectual framework that Rick used to justify dimensional abandonment gradually expanded to encompass other forms of casual cruelty and emotional detachment that characterized his approach to all relationships, responsibilities. The long-term effects of dimensional abandonment on Rick's sense of personal identity and continuity created existential problems that no amount of technological sophistication could adequately address or resolve. The repeated process of assuming the identities and histories of dead alternate selves gradually eroded Rick's connection to his original personality and experiences, creating uncertainties about which memories were authentic and which relationships had genuine foundations in shared experience rather than performed deception. The multiplication of false identities and manufactured histories made it increasingly difficult for Rick to maintain coherent understanding of who he was or what he valued beyond immediate practical objectives. The pattern of dimensional abandonment established behavioral templates that Rick would eventually apply to other forms of relationship and commitment, treating marriages, friendships, professional obligations, and even his own psychological health as disposable resources that could be abandoned when they became inconvenient or challenging. The habit of escape rather than engagement systematically destroyed his capacity for the kind of sustained effort and emotional vulnerability that meaningful personal development required, creating cycles of avoidance that made authentic growth and healing increasingly unlikely as time passed. The technology that made dimensional abandonment possible also created ongoing temptations and escape routes that prevented Rick from developing the tolerance for discomfort and frustration that mature problem-solving required in situations where technological shortcuts were not available or appropriate. The portal gun became a psychological crutch that eliminated incentives for developing patience, persistence, and the ability to work through interpersonal conflicts or personal limitations that could not be circumvented through dimensional travel. The ease of abandonment made it increasingly difficult for Rick to engage authentically with problems that required sustained emotional investment and acceptance of uncertainty about outcomes. The ultimate tragedy of dimensional abandonment lay not in its immediate consequences, but in its systematic destruction of Rick's capacity for the kind of authentic emotional investment and moral commitment that made existence meaningful for conscious beings throughout the multiverse. The man who had once been willing to sacrifice unlimited power for the sake of his family relationships had become someone who could abandon entire worlds rather than accepting responsibility for cleaning up the messes his actions had created, demonstrating how technological capability without moral development inevitably led to forms of corruption that destroyed everything that had originally made life worth living. The love potion cascade, science as violation. The love potion catastrophe that transformed Rick's seemingly innocent attempt to help Morty with his romantic insecurities into a global pandemic of monstrous mutations, stands as perhaps the most perfect encapsulation of how Rick's approach to human problems consistently escalates minor, interpersonal difficulties into existential threats that affect entire populations who never consented to participate in his experiments. The casual manner in which Rick treated Morty's request for romantic assistance revealed his fundamental inability to understand that emotional connections between human beings require patience, authenticity, and respect for the complex social and psychological processes that make genuine relationships possible, rather than technological shortcuts that bypass the natural development of trust, attraction, and mutual understanding through shared experience and gradual discovery. The scientific principles that Rick employed in creating his love potion demonstrated sophisticated understanding of neurochemistry and behavioral psychology, but his application of this knowledge revealed complete disregard for the ethical frameworks and safety protocols that responsible researchers develop to prevent their work from causing harm to individuals or communities. The compound he synthesized was designed to alter fundamental aspects of human consciousness and emotional response without any consideration for the long-term effects on Jessica's mental health, personal autonomy, or capacity for authentic relationships in the future. The fact that Rick treated Jessica's feelings as variables to be manipulated rather than expressions of her individual personality and preferences demonstrated his systematic objectification of other people as resources to be exploited rather than autonomous beings deserving of respect and consideration. The mechanism by which Rick's love potion operated revealed his casual willingness to violate the most basic principles of consent and bodily autonomy that form the foundation of ethical human interaction. The compound was designed to override Jessica's natural emotional responses and replace them with artificially induced attraction that bore no relationship to her actual feelings, preferences, or choices about who she wanted to spend time with or develop romantic connections toward. The transformation of her consciousness through chemical manipulation represented a form of assault that was arguably more invasive and damaging than physical violence, since it targeted the aspects of her identity and personality that made her a unique individual rather than simply causing temporary physical harm. The airborne transmission mechanism that Rick built into his love potion revealed either catastrophic incompetence in basic laboratory safety procedures or deliberate indifference to the possibility that his experiment might affect populations beyond its intended target. The decision to create a compound that could spread through respiratory contact demonstrated complete failure to consider containment protocols or emergency response procedures that might limit the spread of contamination if the initial application produced unexpected results. The casual assumption that biological weapons could be deployed in populated areas without adequate safeguards suggested that Rick viewed the entire human population as acceptable test subjects for his experimental compounds. The rapid escalation from localized romantic manipulation to school-wide infection revealed how Rick's technological capabilities far exceeded his understanding of complex systems and the unpredictable ways that biological and social phenomena interact when subjected to artificial manipulation. The spread of the love potion through Morty's school created cascading effects that transformed an educational environment into a site of psychological horror, where students and faculty lost control of their emotional responses and behavioral patterns. The chaos that resulted from dozens of teenagers experiencing artificially induced romantic obsessions simultaneously created dangerous situations that threatened the physical safety and psychological well-being of everyone present. The global pandemic that emerged when Rick's attempted cure for the school infection interacted with existing biological and environmental factors, demonstrated his complete failure to understand that complex problems require careful analysis and systematic approaches rather than hasty, technological fixes applied without adequate testing or consideration for secondary effects. The mutation of the love potion, through contact with different genetic backgrounds and medical conditions, created variants that spread more rapidly and caused more severe psychological and physiological changes than the original compound. The transformation of Earth's human population into creatures whose obsession with Morty had completely overwhelmed their capacity for rational thought or normal social behavior represented Rick's inadvertent creation of a new form of life that was simultaneously dependent on and threatening to his grandson. The Cronenberg mutations that resulted from Rick's second attempted cure revealed his willingness to cause horrific physical suffering if it simplified his personal situation or reduced the complexity of problems he was expected to solve. The grotesque transformations that converted human beings into twisted amalgamations of organic matter were presented by Rick as acceptable solutions to the psychological effects of the love potion, demonstrating his complete indifference to the pain and horror that his victims experienced during their metamorphosis into creatures that could no longer recognize themselves or maintain normal relationships with their families and communities. The casual manner in which he observed these transformations suggested that he viewed human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business rather than a tragedy that deserved attention and concern. The decision to abandon the Cronenberg dimension rather than attempting to develop genuine cures for the mutations he had caused revealed Rick's fundamental approach to responsibility and consequences throughout his scientific career. Rather than accepting that his actions had created problems that required sustained effort and emotional investment to address properly, Rick chose to escape to a dimension where the same problems had been solved by alternate versions of himself who had died before they could enjoy the benefits of their success. The efficiency with which he located and invaded this replacement dimension demonstrated how quickly he had adapted to treating entire worlds as disposable resources rather than communities deserving of consideration and respect. The psychological impact on Morty of witnessing the global consequences of what had begun as a simple request for romantic advice created forms of trauma and guilt that Rick systematically dismissed as irrelevant emotional responses that interfered with practical problem solving. The boy's horror at seeing his entire species transformed into monsters because of his desire to impress Jessica was not teenage melodrama, but legitimate recognition that his actions, mediated through Rick's technological capabilities, had caused suffering on scales that exceeded anything in recorded human history. Rick's casual treatment of Morty's emotional distress as weakness rather than appropriate response to genuine tragedy demonstrated his systematic destruction of his grandson's capacity for normal moral reasoning and in empathetic response. The long-term effects of the love potion disaster on Morty's psychological development were compounded by Rick's presentation of dimensional abandonment as a normal and acceptable solution to problems that seemed too complex or emotionally demanding to address through sustained effort and responsibility. The lesson that Morty learned from their escape to a replacement dimension was not that actions have consequences that must be faced with courage and determination, but rather that sufficiently advanced technology could eliminate the need for moral accountability by providing escape routes that avoided, rather than resolved, the suffering that careless actions had created. The abandoned Cronenberg dimension was left to develop new forms of civilization and social organization, adapted to the physical and psychological transformations that Rick's experiments had imposed on its population. The resilience and creativity that the mutated humans demonstrated in building sustainable communities despite their grotesque appearances and altered behavioral patterns highlighted possibilities for redemption and growth that Rick had, dismissed as too difficult or time-consuming to pursue. The success of these post-disaster societies suggested that Rick's abandonment had been motivated more by his own psychological limitations than by genuine impossibility of developing solutions that could have addressed the problems he had created. The scientific knowledge that Rick had gained through creating and attempting to cure the love potion disaster was subsequently applied to other projects that demonstrated similar patterns of casual experimentation on unwilling subjects, followed by abandonment when the results became inconvenient or emotionally demanding to address. The techniques he developed for manipulating neurochemistry and behavioral responses became standard tools in his arsenal of devices for controlling and exploiting other people, particularly family members whose emotional dependence made them vulnerable to chemical manipulation disguised as medical treatment or enhancement. The ethical frameworks that normal scientific communities had developed to prevent research from causing harm to human subjects were completely absent from Rick's approach to experimentation, creating ongoing patterns of casual violation that treated consent, safety, and long-term well-being as optional considerations rather than fundamental requirements for responsible research. The love potion disaster established templates for future projects that would consistently prioritize Rick's convenience and intellectual curiosity over the welfare of populations who became unwilling participants in his studies of consciousness, behavior, and social dynamics. The broader implications of the love potion cascade extended beyond immediate concerns about Rick's personal ethics to encompass questions about the responsibilities that accompanied advanced technological capabilities and the passion-passive institutional frameworks that might be necessary to prevent individuals with godlike power from causing systematic harm to populations who lacked the knowledge or resources to protect themselves from such exploitation. The casual manner in which Rick had transformed a romantic comedy scenario into a horror movie suggested that unrestricted scientific capability without corresponding moral development inevitably led to catastrophic consequences for everyone except the perpetrator. The pattern of escalation that characterized the love potion disaster would be repeated in numerous subsequent adventures where Rick's initial interventions in relatively minor problems created exponentially greater difficulties that affected larger populations and required increasingly extreme solutions that caused additional suffering for people who had never asked for his assistance or protection. The cycle of problem creation followed by abandonment became Rick's standard operating procedure for dealing with the consequences of his actions, creating ongoing patterns of exploitation and neglect that treated entire worlds as testing grounds for his experimental compounds and devices. The transformation of Morty from innocent victim of Rick's experimentation into willing participant in dimensional abandonment and identity replacement marked a crucial turning point in his psychological development that would influence every subsequent decision he made about moral responsibility and emotional investment in relationships and communities. The normalization of suffering and abandonment that resulted from the love potion disaster created psychological foundations that would eventually enable Morty to participate in and even initiate similar projects that caused comparable harm to innocent populations throughout the multiverse. The ultimate horror of the love potion cascade lay not in its immediate consequences, but in its demonstration of how easily well-intentioned efforts to help someone could be transformed into systematic violation and abandonment when filtered through philosophical frameworks that treated other people as problems to be solved rather than individuals deserving of respect and genuine care. Rick's failure to understand that authentic relationships required patience, vulnerability, and acceptance of rejection as natural aspects of human connection had transformed a grandfather's attempt to help his grandson into a cautionary tale about the dangers of applying unlimited technological capability to problems that could only be solved through emotional maturity and moral development that Rick had systematically destroyed in himself through decades of avoiding rather than accepting the responsibilities that came with his extraordinary capabilities and intelligence. Memory manipulation and identity destruction. The systematic violation of consciousness and memory that Rick routinely employs as a tool for managing family relationships and avoiding emotional accountability represents perhaps the most insidious form of abuse documented in the annals of interdimensional psychology, demonstrating how advanced neurotechnology could be weaponized to destroy the fundamental foundations of personal identity and authentic human connection. The casual manner in which Rick alters, erases, and fabricates memories in his family members reveals his complete inability to engage with emotional conflicts or moral responsibilities through honest communication and mutual respect, instead choosing to rewrite the psychological landscapes of people he claims to love, rather than accepting the discomfort and vulnerability that genuine relationships require from all participants. The technology that enables Rick's memory manipulation represents scientific achievement that borders on the divine, incorporating understanding of consciousness, neural architecture, and personal identity that exceeds anything accomplished by conventional neuroscience or cognitive psychology. The devices he constructs can isolate specific memory engrams, alter their emotional associations, fabricate completely artificial experiences that integrate seamlessly with authentic recollections, and modify personality structures in ways that leave his victims unable to distinguish between genuine memories and manufactured experiences. The precision with which these interventions can be targeted suggests mastery over the fundamental mechanisms of human consciousness that transforms Rick from brilliant scientist into something approaching a god of personal identity and subjective experience. The ethical implications of memory manipulation transcend normal categories of violation and abuse to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of personal autonomy and the relationship between consciousness and identity that form the philosophical foundations of human dignity and individual rights. The ability to alter someone's memories without their knowledge or consent represents perhaps the most intimate form of assault possible, targeting not just their physical safety or emotional well-being, but the very continuity of experience that makes them recognizable to themselves as coherent individuals with consistent values, relationships, and personal history. The violation of memory is simultaneously violation of past, present, and future identity, creating forms of damage that cannot be adequately understood or addressed through conventional therapeutic frameworks. Rick's motivations for manipulating family memories consistently prioritize his own psychological comfort and convenience over the welfare and autonomy of his victims, demonstrating patterns of narcissistic abuse that exploit advanced technology to maintain control over relationships that should be based on mutual respect and emotional authenticity. The memories he chooses to alter or erase are typically those that would create accountability for his own harmful behaviors or force him to engage with emotional consequences that he finds uncomfortable or inconvenient. The fabricated experiences he implants serve to reinforce narratives about family dynamics that support his preferred role as protective patriarch, rather than acknowledging the reality of his systematic manipulation and emotional neglect. The memory work Rick performs on Beth represents perhaps his most sophisticated and psychologically damaging application of consciousness manipulation, targeting her fundamental sense of identity and moral responsibility in ways that create ongoing dependency on his guidance and approval, while simultaneously destroying her capacity for independent judgment about her own experiences and relationships. The childhood memories he has altered or fabricated serve to reinforce his image as a caring father while concealing evidence of neglect, emotional abuse, and exposure to dangerous situations that would normally create lasting trauma and justified resentment. The artificial recollections he has implanted provide Beth with false foundations for understanding herself and her relationships that make authentic self-knowledge and emotional healing virtually impossible to achieve. The clone situation that Rick created as a solution to Beth's identity crisis represents the ultimate expression of his willingness to violate personal autonomy and authentic choice through technological manipulation disguised as expanded opportunity and freedom. The decision to create two versions of Beth and then erase his own memory of which one had chosen to leave Earth eliminated Beth's agency in determining her own life path, while providing Rick with plausible deniability about the plausible deniability, consequences of forcing his daughter to choose between family, obligations, and personal fulfillment. The memory erasure that accompanied the cloning process ensured that Rick could maintain relationships with both versions of Beth without experiencing guilt or emotional discomfort about the deception and manipulation that made such relationships possible. The psychological impact on both versions of Beth from Rick's cloning and memory manipulation created forms of existential uncertainty and identity confusion that exceeded anything that normal therapeutic intervention could adequately address or resolve. Neither Beth could be certain whether her memories were authentic or artificially constructed, whether her personality represented genuine development or technological modification, or whether her relationships with family members were based on shared experiences or elaborate performances designed to maintain Rick's emotional comfort. The fundamental uncertainty about personal identity and authentic experience created ongoing anxiety and depression that manifested in increasingly self-destructive behaviors and relationship patterns. The memory manipulation that Rick performs on Jerry is typically designed to eliminate his recollections of Rick's more obviously abusive or criminal behaviors, while reinforcing his sense of inadequacy and dependence on Rick's superior intelligence and technological capabilities. The selective editing of Jerry's memories serves to maintain family dynamics that position Rick as the competent problem solver, while portraying Jerry as incompetent and unreliable, creating ongoing psychological conditions that justify Rick's continued control over family decision-making processes. The fabricated memories that Rick implants often involve scenarios where Jerry's independent actions led to negative consequences, reinforcing patterns of learned helplessness and emotional dependence. The children in Rick's family are particularly vulnerable to memory manipulation because their developing consciousness and incomplete understanding of normal psychological boundaries make them unable to recognize or resist the subtle alterations that Rick makes to their recollections of traumatic or inappropriate experiences. Summer and Morty's memories of dangerous adventures are routinely edited to remove elements that might create lasting psychological trauma or interfere with their willingness to participate in future expeditions. The systematic removal of authentic emotional responses to violence, death, and moral complexity prevents them from developing normal protective instincts and ethical reasoning that might challenge Rick's authority or question his methods. The philosophical horror of Rick's memory manipulation extends beyond immediate concerns about individual violations to encompass broader questions about the nature of reality and authentic experience in contexts where advanced technology makes it impossible to distinguish between genuine and boson, artificial recollections. The family members who live with Rick exist in states of ongoing epistemological uncertainty, where their most fundamental beliefs about themselves, their relationships, and their personal history may be elaborate fabrications designed to serve someone else's psychological needs. The impossibility of verifying the authenticity of their own memories creates forms of existential anxiety that undermine their capacity for confident decision-making and emotional stability. The social implications of memory manipulation technology extend far beyond Rick's immediate family to encompass entire communities and institutions whose members may be unknowing victims of consciousness alteration designed to serve Rick's broader strategic objectives or personal convenience. The teachers, neighbors, and community officials who interact with the Smith family may have had their memories modified to explain inconsistencies in behavior or appearance that result from dimensional travel, identity replacement, or other activities that Rick prefers to keep secret. The casual manner in which Rick violates the consciousness of innocent bystanders demonstrates his complete indifference to the autonomy and dignity of anyone whose welfare conflicts with his immediate objectives. The long-term effects of systematic memory manipulation on family dynamics create psychological environments that make authentic intimacy and emotional growth virtually impossible for any family member to achieve or maintain. The constant uncertainty about whether their feelings and responses are genuine or artificially induced prevents family members from developing confidence in their own judgment or emotional reactions. The inability to trust their own memories makes it impossible for them to learn from experience or develop consistent patterns of personal growth and relationship development that require continuity of identity and experience over extended periods of time. The therapeutic challenges created by Rick's memory manipulation represent problems that exceed the capabilities of conventional psychological treatment methods. Since effective therapy depends on clients having access to accurate information about their own experiences and emotional development, family members who seek professional help for depression, anxiety, or relationship problems cannot receive appropriate treatment when their recollections of traumatic or formative experiences have been systematically altered or fabricated. The integration of artificial memories with authentic experiences creates psychological landscapes that resist normal therapeutic approaches and may require interventions that do not currently exist within established medical practice. Rick's own relationship to memory manipulation reveals the extent to which he has used these technologies on himself as methods for avoiding emotional responsibility and maintaining psychological equilibrium in the face of choices and behaviors that would normally create unbearable guilt or self-recrimination. The selective editing of his own recollections allows him to maintain self-image as protective family patriarch while suppressing awareness of the systematic abuse and manipulation that characterizes his actual behavior toward people he claims to love. The artificial memories he has created about his own motivations and emotional responses enable him to experience genuine feelings of affection and concern, while remaining unconscious of the calculating cruelty that drives his treatment of others. The technological infrastructure required to maintain Rick's ongoing memory manipulation operations creates dependencies and vulnerabilities that make his control over family relationships increasingly fragile and unsustainable as family members begin to develop awareness of inconsistencies and gaps in their recollections. The devices and procedures needed for routine consciousness alteration require significant time and energy investments that limit Rick's ability to pursue other interests and projects. The complexity of maintaining coherent false narratives across multiple individuals and extended time periods creates ongoing potential for discovery and confrontation that threatens the entire system of control that Rick has constructed around his family relationships. The possibility that Rick's memory manipulation might be detected by family members who develop sufficient awareness and investigative capability creates ongoing anxiety and paranoia that influences every aspect of his interactions with them. The constant need to monitor their psychological states and modify their recollections when they begin to approach dangerous insights transforms his relationships with them into elaborate performances designed to maintain deceptions rather than authentic emotional connections. The exhaustion and isolation that result from this constant vigilance contribute to Rick's increasing reliance on alcohol and other substances as methods for numbing emotional responses that his manipulation has made impossible to address through honest communication. The ultimate tragedy of Rick's memory manipulation lies not just in the immediate harm it causes to his family members, but in its systematic destruction of the possibility for authentic emotional healing and genuine relationship repair that could potentially address the underlying problems that motivated his controlling behavior in the first place. The same technological capabilities that enable him to avoid accountability for his harmful behaviors also prevent him from receiving the honest feedback and emotional challenge that might promote personal growth and positive change in his treatment of others. The artificial relationships that memory manipulation creates provide neither Rick nor his family members with the genuine human connection that all of them desperately need for psychological health and emotional fulfillment. The Omega device and multiversal genocide, the revelation of Rick Prime's ultimate weapon, represents perhaps the most philosophically and morally devastating achievement in the entire history of interdimensional science, demonstrating how unlimited technological capability combined with complete emotional detachment could produce instruments of destruction that transcended normal concepts of murder and genocide to become systematic erasure of existence itself across infinite realities. The Omega device that Rick Prime constructed was not merely a weapon designed to kill individual targets, but rather a cosmic-scale instrument of annihilation that could eliminate specific individuals from every dimension, simultaneously transforming murder from localized violence into multiversal editing that rewrote the fundamental structure of reality to exclude particular people from ever having existed anywhere at any time throughout the infinite expanse of possible worlds. The theoretical framework underlying the Omega device required Rick Prime to develop understanding of consciousness and identity that extended beyond conventional physics and neuroscience to encompass metaphysical principles governing the relationship between individual existence and dimensional boundaries across infinite realities. The mathematics involved in targeting specific consciousness patterns for elimination while leaving all other aspects of dimensional structure intact exceeded anything that normal scientific education could provide, suggesting years or decades of research into the fundamental nature of identity that treated sentient beings as mathematical objects that could be surgically removed from reality through sufficiently sophisticated technological intervention. The precision required to eliminate individual people without causing catastrophic damage to the dimensional matrices that supported their existence demanded mastery over forces that normal beings could not even perceive, much less understand or manipulate. The construction of the Omega device represented engineering achievement that bordered on divine capability. incorporating energy manipulation systems that could reach across dimensional boundaries to simultaneously target infinite versions of the same individual, while maintaining surgical precision that eliminated only the intended victims without affecting anyone or anything else within their respective realities. The power requirements for such massive multiversal operations exceeded the energy output of entire galactic civilizations, forcing Rick Prime to develop extraction and storage technologies that treated stellar systems as disposable fuel sources for his personal weapons projects. The casual manner in which he requisitioned the energy of dying stars and consumed the resources of entire planets demonstrated his complete evolution beyond normal concepts of conservation or environmental responsibility. The systematic nature of Rick Prime's campaign against Diane across infinite dimensions revealed planning and coordination that operated on temporal scales, exceeding normal human life expectancy, suggesting that his dedication to causing Rick C-137 maximum psychological damage had become the organizing principle around which he structured his entire existence. The identification and targeting of every possible version of Diane required surveillance operations that penetrated infinite realities, catalogued their populations, and tracked the development of relationships between alternates of Rick and his future wife across countless different historical and social contexts. The patience and thoroughness with which Rick Prime conducted this multiversal genocide demonstrated obsession that had transcended normal human psychology to become something approaching cosmic-scale pathology. The emotional and psychological devastation that Rick Prime achieved through his systematic elimination of Diane from infinite realities exceeded anything that conventional murder or even conventional genocide could accomplish, creating forms of loss that transcended normal categories of grief and trauma to encompass existential horror about the nature of love and connection across infinite possibilities. Rick C-137's discovery that his wife had been murdered, not just in his own dimension but in every reality where she might have existed, eliminated even the comfort of knowing that somewhere in the multiverse, some version of their relationship had been allowed to flourish and develop naturally. The totality of this destruction created psychological wounds that no amount of revenge or technological achievement could possibly heal or compensate. The philosophical implications of the Omega device extended far beyond immediate concerns about Rick Prime's personal cruelty to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of existence and meaning in contexts where individual lives could be retroactively erased from reality through technological intervention by sufficiently advanced beings. The possibility that entire categories of people could be eliminated from existence across infinite dimensions raised questions about the security and authenticity of anyone's existence that transcended normal concerns about mortality or personal safety. If Diane could be systematically erased from every possible reality, then the same fate could potentially befall anyone who attracted the attention of beings with comparable technological capabilities and psychological motivations. The target selection process that Rick Prime employed in choosing Diane for multiversal elimination revealed sophisticated understanding of Rick C-137's psychology and emotional vulnerabilities that could only have been acquired through extensive observation and analysis of his behavior patterns across multiple contexts and situations. The decision to eliminate Rick's wife rather than Rick himself demonstrated strategic thinking that prioritized maximum psychological damage over simple elimination of threats, creating ongoing suffering that would persist for decades rather than ending Rick's pain through direct assassination. The cruelty of this approach exceeded normal human concepts of revenge to become something approaching cosmic-scale sadism designed to transform Rick C-137's entire existence into monument to Rick Prime's superior capability and emotional detachment. The technology required to maintain the Omega device's targeting systems across infinite dimensions created ongoing surveillance and monitoring operations that treated every reality where Rick existed as potential battlefield in Rick Prime's war against his alternate self. The sensors and tracking systems that enabled precise identification and elimination of Diane variants required Rick Prime to maintain ongoing presence and observation across countless realities, transforming him from individual scientist into something approaching multiversal intelligence agency, whose resources and capabilities exceeded those of entire interdimensional civilizations. The dedication of such vast technological infrastructure to personal revenge demonstrated how unlimited power could corrupt even brilliant minds into instruments of systematic destruction. The operational security required to conceal the Omega device's existence and prevent other Ricks from developing countermeasures or defensive technologies forced Rick Prime to operate in complete isolation, severing his connections to potential allies or collaborators who might have questioned his methods or attempted to moderate his objectives. The paranoia and secrecy that surrounded the project gradually transformed Rick Prime from someone who had rejected normal human limitations into someone who had also rejected normal human connections, creating psychological conditions that made his cruelty not just possible, but psychologically necessary, as validation of his superiority over beings who remained constrained by emotional attachments and moral considerations. The testing and calibration process that Rick Prime employed to ensure the Omega device's effectiveness required him to conduct preliminary eliminations on targets who served as experimental subjects for refining his targeting, protocols, and energy distribution systems. The unnamed and uncounted victims who disappeared during these testing phases represented casualties of Rick Prime's technological development process, beings whose existence was sacrificed to perfect weapons systems designed to cause suffering to someone they had never met or interacted with in any meaningful way. The casual manner in which Rick Prime treated these test eliminations as routine research activities demonstrated his complete transformation from someone who had once possessed normal human empathy into something that operated according to purely technical criteria, without regard for moral implications. The psychological satisfaction that Rick Prime derived from successfully eliminating Diane from infinite realities revealed the extent to which his identity and sense of purpose had become organized around causing pain to Rick C-137, rather than pursuing any positive objectives or creative achievements that might have justified his extraordinary capabilities. The completion of his multiversal genocide represented not achievement of meaningful goals, but rather successful implementation of elaborate revenge fantasy that had consumed years or decades of his existence without producing anything that could be considered beneficial or constructive for anyone, including himself. The hollow victory that followed Diane's elimination left Rick Prime without clear purpose or direction, beyond continuing to torment his alternate self through increasingly elaborate and sophisticated forms of psychological warfare. The defensive countermeasures that Rick Prime developed to protect himself from retaliation by Rick C-137 or other potential enemies demonstrated awareness that his actions had created existential threats to his own security, while also revealing his confidence that his technological superiority could overcome any challenges that less advanced beings might attempt to organize against him. The backup systems and contingency plans that surrounded the Omega device created multiple layers of protection that made Rick Prime virtually untouchable through conventional means, requiring anyone who wished to challenge him to develop comparable understanding of multiversal physics and consciousness manipulation. The arrogance that these defensive measures reflected ultimately contributed to Rick Prime's eventual downfall by creating overconfidence that prevented him from adequately preparing for threats that combined technological sophistication with tactical approaches he had not anticipated. The broader implications of the Omega device for interdimensional civilization represented existential challenges that exceeded any previous threats to the stability and security of conscious beings throughout the multiverse. The precedent that Rick Prime had established by successfully eliminating specific individuals from all possible realities created potential for similar attacks by other beings who possessed comparable technological capabilities, psychological motivations. The knowledge that such weapons existed and could be successfully deployed created ongoing anxiety and defensive preparations that transformed interdimensional politics into continuous warfare between potential targets and potential perpetrators of multiversal genocide. The diplomatic and military responses that various interdimensional authorities attempted to organize against Rick Prime were consistently undermined by the scale and sophistication of the threats he posed, creating recognition that conventional institutions and legal frameworks were inadequate for addressing crimes that transcended normal categories of violence and destruction. The failure of established governance systems to prevent or punish multiversal genocide created ongoing instability and fear that made cooperation and trust between different dimensional civilizations increasingly difficult to maintain. The breakdown of interdimensional law and order that resulted from Rick Prime's activities created conditions that enabled other individuals and organizations to pursue similar projects without meaningful opposition or accountability. The scientific knowledge that Rick Prime had developed during his creation and deployment of the Omega device represented information that was simultaneously invaluable and extremely dangerous, creating ongoing debates about whether such knowledge should be preserved for potential defensive applications or destroyed to prevent its misuse by future individuals who might lack even Rick Prime's limited moral constraints. The technical specifications and theoretical frameworks that enabled multiversal elimination could potentially be used to develop countermeasures and protective technologies, but they could also provide blueprints for other beings who wish to conduct similar campaigns of systematic destruction against their own enemies or rivals. The long-term effects of Rick Prime's multiversal genocide on the structure and stability of the dimensional matrix that supported infinite realities remained unclear and potentially catastrophic, creating ongoing uncertainty about whether his eliminations of specific individuals might have created cascading damage that would eventually affect entire categories of existence. The surgical precision that Rick Prime had claimed to achieve in his targeting of Diane might have been less accurate than he believed, creating possibilities for systematic damage to dimensional boundaries and consciousness-supporting infrastructure that could affect the security and stability of everyone who existed within the compromised dimensional cluster. The ultimate irony of Rick Prime's achievement with the Omega device lay in its demonstration that unlimited technological capability applied to personal revenge could produce results that exceeded their creator's psychological capacity to derive satisfaction or meaning from their success. The completion of his campaign against Diane provided Rick Prime with proof of his superiority over Rick C-137, but did not address the underlying emptiness and purposelessness that had motivated his transformation from normal scientist into cosmic-scale monster. The hollow victory that followed his successful genocide left him without clear objectives or sources of meaning beyond continuing to torment his alternate self through increasingly elaborate and ultimately pointless demonstrations of his technological dominance and emotional detachment, the torture of infinite possibilities, the existential horror that accompanies true understanding of infinite dimensions represents perhaps the most psychologically devastating consequence of Rick's scientific achievements, transforming the wonder and possibility that should accompany cosmic awareness into sources of unbearable anxiety and meaninglessness that systematically destroy the capacity for satisfaction, purpose, or genuine emotional investment in any particular outcome or relationship. The knowledge that every possible version of every conceivable event exists simultaneously across infinite realities creates philosophical problems that transcend normal human capacity for psychological adaptation, forcing conscious beings who achieve multiversal awareness to confront the reality that their choices, achievements, and relationships are simultaneously unique and completely insignificant within the broader context of unlimited possibility and endless repetition. The mathematical implications of infinite dimensions extend far beyond simple acknowledgement that alternate versions of familiar people and places exist across dimensional boundaries to encompass the recognition that every conceivable variation of every possible situation occurs somewhere within the infinite expanse of parallel realities. The conversations that Rick has with his family members are simultaneously taking place in dimensions where those same words are being spoken with different emotional contexts, different outcomes, and different implications for the relationships between participants. The adventures that provide excitement and meaning in one reality are routine occurrences in others, while catastrophic disasters that threaten entire civilizations are minor inconveniences that are easily resolved through technological solutions that exist readily available in dimensions where different choices led to different developments in scientific knowledge and capability. The psychological impact of recognizing that infinite versions of oneself exist across dimensional boundaries creates identity problems that exceed anything addressed by conventional philosophy or psychology, forcing individuals to confront questions about personal uniqueness and significance that undermine the foundations of normal self-concept and emotional investment in personal development and achievement. The Rick who takes pride in his scientific accomplishments must simultaneously acknowledge that identical achievements have been made by countless alternate versions of himself who may have arrived at the same discoveries through different methods or applied them to different purposes. The uniqueness that forms the basis of individual identity becomes meaningless when infinite alternates exist who share the same memories, capabilities, and personality traits while making different choices that lead to different outcomes. The recognition that every possible choice exists across dimensional boundaries transforms decision-making from meaningful expression of values and priorities into arbitrary selection between options that are all equally real and equally consequences somewhere within the multiverse. The moral weight that normally accompanies significant decisions disappears when individuals understand that alternate versions of themselves are simultaneously making every other possible choice in parallel dimensions, creating situations where personal responsibility becomes philosophically incoherent. The Rick who chooses to help his family exists alongside infinite versions who choose to harm them, abandon them, or ignore them entirely, making any particular choice seem simultaneously crucial and completely irrelevant. The emotional implications of infinite possibility create forms of paralysis and detachment that make authentic investment in relationships and projects increasingly difficult to maintain as awareness of alternatives grows more complete and immediate. The love that Rick feels for his family members is undermined by knowledge that identical emotions exist in dimensions where those same relationships lead to different outcomes. where the people he cares about make different choices, or where external circumstances create different contexts for their interactions. The significance of particular moments of joy, connection, or achievement is diminished by awareness that infinite variations of those experiences exist across dimensional boundaries, some more intense and meaningful than his own. The concept of loss and tragedy becomes philosophically problematic within the context of infinite dimensions, since the death or suffering of individuals in particular realities is balanced by their continued existence and happiness in alternate dimensions, where different circumstances prevented or alleviated their problems. The grief that Rick experiences over the deaths of Diane and Beth is simultaneously justified by their absence from his reality and rendered questionable by their continued existence across infinite dimensions where Rick Prime never arrived or where Rick C-137 made different choices that protected them from harm. The intensity of his emotional responses to their deaths conflicts with intellectual recognition that identical versions of his family continue to exist and flourish in dimensions that remain accessible through portal technology. The search for meaning and purpose becomes exponentially more difficult when individuals understand that every possible goal they might pursue has already been achieved by alternate versions of themselves, while other alternates have failed in identical attempts or chosen to pursue entirely different objectives. The scientific discoveries that provide Rick with sense of accomplishment and intellectual satisfaction are simultaneously being made by countless other Ricks who may derive different meanings from identical achievements, or who may have transcended the need for such validation through different paths of personal development. The competition and achievement that normally drive human motivation become meaningless when infinite versions of every possible success and failure exist across dimensional boundaries. The relationship between effort and outcome is fundamentally altered by awareness of infinite possibilities, since any action taken in one dimension is accompanied by knowledge that alternate versions of the same person are taking different actions that may produce better or worse results through no difference in capability or dedication. The Rick who works diligently to solve particular problems exists alongside versions who achieve superior results through different approaches, or who fail despite identical efforts due to external circumstances beyond their control. The connection between personal agency and consequences that forms the basis of normal motivation and self-evaluation becomes tenuous when infinite variations of every scenario play out simultaneously across dimensional boundaries. The psychological defense mechanisms that Rick develops to cope with multiversal awareness represent sophisticated but ultimately inadequate attempts to maintain functional relationships and meaningful goals, despite philosophical understanding that undermines the foundations of human motivation and emotional attachment. The nihilistic worldview that he adopts serves as protection against the existential anxiety that accompanies recognition of infinite possibility, but it also systematically destroys his capacity for the kind of emotional investment and moral commitment that make existence tolerable for conscious beings throughout the multiverse. The alcohol consumption and emotional detachment that characterize his behavior are symptoms of underlying psychological damage caused by knowledge that exceeds human capacity for healthy integration and adaptation. The impact of multiversal awareness on Rick's relationships with family members creates ongoing tensions between his genuine affection for them and his intellectual recognition that their individual characteristics and choices are replicated across infinite dimensions where different versions of the same relationships develop along different trajectories. The Morty who accompanies Rick on adventures is simultaneously unique and completely interchangeable, creating psychological conditions that make authentic emotional investment extremely difficult to maintain over extended periods. The knowledge that infinite replacement Mortys exist across dimensional boundaries undermines the significance of his particular grandson's development, safety, and happiness. The educational implications of infinite possibility create moral problems for Rick's approach to mentoring Morty, since any lessons he attempts to teach are simultaneously being learned and ignored by alternate versions of his grandson, across dimensions where different circumstances create different learning opportunities and outcomes. The experiences that Rick provides for Morty's development exist alongside infinite variations, where the same adventures produce different results, or where different adventures provide superior educational value through approaches that Rick has not considered or attempted. The responsibility that normally accompanies mentorship becomes questionable when infinite alternates of every possible teaching approach exist across dimensional boundaries. The social and political implications of infinite dimensions extend beyond individual psychology to encompass questions about the value of institutions, laws, and collective efforts that govern relationships between conscious beings across particular realities. The governments and organizations that attempt to maintain order and justice within specific dimensions exist alongside infinite alternates where different approaches to social organization produce different results, making it difficult to evaluate the effectiveness or moral worth of any particular system of governance or social coordination. The efforts that individuals make to improve conditions within their own realities seem insignificant when infinite variations of every possible improvement exist across dimensional boundaries. The artistic and creative implications of infinite possibility create challenges for individuals who seek meaning through expression and aesthetic achievement, since every conceivable work of art or literature exists somewhere within the multiverse, regardless of whether particular individuals choose to create them. The novels that writers struggle to complete exist in finished form across dimensions where different authors made different choices, or where the same authors worked under different circumstances that enabled or prevented their creative success. The significance of individual artistic achievement is undermined by recognition that infinite variations of every possible creative work exist across dimensional boundaries. The scientific and technological implications of infinite dimensions create philosophical problems for researchers who seek knowledge and understanding through investigation of natural phenomena, since every possible discovery and every conceivable application of scientific knowledge exists somewhere within the multiverse. The breakthrough insights that provide scientists with sense of accomplishment and contribution to human knowledge are simultaneously being achieved by infinite alternates who may apply the same discoveries to different purposes, or who may have transcended the need for such knowledge through different paths of development. The value of scientific progress becomes questionable when infinite variations of every possible technological capability exist across dimensional boundaries. The temporal implications of infinite possibility extend beyond simple recognition that alternate versions of events occur across dimensional boundaries, to encompass awareness that different dimensions may operate according to different temporal structures that create varying relationships between past, present, and future experiences. The linear progression of time that provides structure and meaning for human experience in normal contexts becomes less significant when individuals understand that their past decisions exist alongside alternate histories where different choices led to different outcomes, while their future possibilities are simultaneously being explored by alternate versions across infinite dimensions. The ultimate psychological challenge posed by multiversal awareness lies not in any particular aspect of infinite possibility, but in the cumulative effect of complete understanding on the cognitive and emotional structures that enable conscious beings to maintain functional relationships with reality and meaningful goals for personal development. The knowledge that Rick has acquired through his scientific achievements and dimensional travels exceeds human capacity for healthy integration, creating forms of psychological damage that cannot be adequately addressed through conventional therapeutic approaches or philosophical frameworks designed for beings who remain confined to single realities with limited awareness of cosmic possibility. The tragedy of Rick's situation extends beyond his personal suffering to encompass recognition that his intellectual achievements have systematically destroyed his capacity for the kinds of relationships and experiences that originally motivated his scientific pursuits, creating situations where his greatest successes become sources of existential despair rather than satisfaction or fulfillment. The man who sought knowledge to improve life for his family has acquired understanding that makes authentic family relationships psychologically impossible to maintain, demonstrating how unlimited capability, without corresponding wisdom, inevitably corrupts the very values and goals that made such capability seem desirable in the first place. Family as weapon, the corruption of love. The systematic transformation of family bonds from sources of mutual support and emotional nourishment into instruments of psychological control and validation represents perhaps the most personally devastating aspect of Rick's evolution from damaged human being into cosmic scale manipulator, demonstrating how even the most fundamental human connections could be corrupted by someone whose need for dominance and emotional security had completely overwhelmed their capacity for reciprocal love and genuine concern for others' well-being. The relationships that Rick maintains with Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty are characterized by sophisticated psychological manipulation disguised as protection and guidance, creating family dynamics that serve his emotional needs while systematically undermining the autonomy, self-confidence, and healthy development of people who trust him to act in their best interests rather than his own. The manipulation techniques that Rick employs within his family relationships demonstrate understanding of individual psychology and group dynamics that exceeds anything taught in conventional therapeutic or educational programs, revealing how his scientific intelligence has been applied to developing methods for controlling human behavior that are simultaneously subtle and devastatingly effective. The approaches he uses with each family member are carefully customized to exploit their particular vulnerabilities and emotional needs, creating personalized systems of dependency that make resistance to his influence extremely difficult, while maintaining the appearance of caring relationships based on mutual affection and shared interests rather than systematic exploitation and control. Rick's relationship with Beth represents his most sophisticated and psychologically damaging application of familial manipulation, targeting her unresolved abandonment issues and desperate need for paternal approval to create ongoing dependency that serves his need for validation, while preventing her from developing the emotional independence and self-confidence that healthy adult relationships require. The mixture of genuine affection and calculated exploitation that characterizes his treatment of Beth creates psychological conditions that make it nearly impossible for her to distinguish between authentic expressions of love and strategic behaviors designed to maintain her loyalty and compliance. With his preferences about family dynamics and decision-making processes, the intellectual gifts that Rick shares with Beth serve dual purposes of providing her with capabilities that validate his superior genetics, while also creating ongoing obligations and expectations that tie her emotional well-being to his approval and continued presence in her life. The scientific knowledge and technological access that he provides are presented as expressions of special father-daughter connection, but they also function as forms of psychological currency that must be earned through continued loyalty and acceptance of his authority over major family decisions. The dependency that results from this dynamic makes it extremely difficult for Beth to maintain relationships or pursue goals that might conflict with Rick's preferences or reduce his influence over her choices and priorities. The clone situation that Rick created ostensibly to provide Beth with expanded life choices actually represents his most sophisticated attempt to eliminate the possibility that she might choose independence or personal fulfillment over continued relationship with him. The technology that enabled her to pursue space adventures while maintaining domestic responsibilities removed the need for Beth to make difficult choices about competing priorities, but it also eliminated opportunities for personal growth and moral development that come from accepting limitations and making commitments based on careful consideration of values and responsibilities. The artificial solution that Rick provided prevented Beth from developing the emotional maturity and decision-making capabilities that authentic adulthood requires. Rick's approach to manipulating Jerry demonstrates his sophisticated understanding of masculinity and social status as sources of psychological vulnerability that could be exploited to maintain family dynamics that served his interests while appearing to address Jerry's legitimate needs for respect and meaningful contribution to household management. The systematic undermining of Jerry's confidence and competence creates ongoing conditions that justify Rick's continued dominance over family decision-making, while also providing Jerry with external explanation for his failures and disappointments that prevents him from taking responsibility for personal growth and positive change in his approach to relationships and employment. The adventures and experiences that Rick provides for Jerry are typically designed to reinforce his sense of inadequacy and dependence on Rick's superior capabilities, while occasionally providing just enough validation and success to maintain his emotional investment in their relationship. The mixture of contempt and occasional approval that Rick directs toward Jerry creates psychological conditions similar to those found in abusive relationships, where intermittent positive reinforcement makes the victim more dependent on the abuser's approval, while also more tolerant of ongoing mistreatment and disrespect. The unpredictability of Rick's responses to Jerry's attempts at independence or assertion creates anxiety and learned helplessness that makes sustained resistance to Rick's authority extremely difficult to maintain. The educational approach that Rick takes with Summer reveals his ability to exploit adolescent developmental needs for identity formation and intellectual validation to create loyalty that transcends normal family boundaries, while also preventing her from developing independent moral reasoning and critical thinking capabilities that might challenge his authority or methods. The sophisticated knowledge and experiences that Rick provides for Summer are presented as recognition of her intelligence and potential, but they also serve to isolate her from peer relationships and normal adolescent development that might provide alternative sources of validation and support for personal growth. The adventures that Rick shares with Summer are carefully calibrated to provide excitement and intellectual stimulation, while also exposing her to levels of violence and moral complexity that normalize his casual approach to causing suffering and violating others' autonomy when it serves his immediate objectives. The gradual exposure to increasingly extreme situations serves as desensitization training that reduces Summer's capacity for normal moral responses to cruelty and injustice, while reinforcing her identification with Rick's perspective and methods, rather than developing independent, ethical frameworks based on empathy and concern for others' well-being. Rick's relationship with Morty represents perhaps his most psychologically complex and emotionally significant manipulation, combining genuine affection and protective instincts with systematic corruption of his grandson's moral development and emotional maturity in ways that serve Rick's need for companionship, while also creating ongoing dependency that prevents Morty from developing the independence and self-confidence that would enable him to resist Rick's more harmful influences. The mentorship that Rick provides is simultaneously valuable and destructive, offering Morty experiences and knowledge that exceed anything available through conventional education, while also exposing him to trauma and moral compromise that systematically erode his capacity for normal relationships and healthy emotional development. The adventures that Rick designs for Morty serve multiple functions beyond simple entertainment or education, providing Rick with validation of his superior capabilities, while also creating shared experiences that bond them together through mutual dependency and complicity in activities that normal society would consider morally problematic or psychologically damaging. The gradual escalation of danger and moral complexity in their adventures functions as systematic desensitization that reduces Morty's resistance to participating in increasingly harmful activities, while also creating psychological conditions that make him dependent on Rick's protection and guidance in situations that Rick himself has created. The emotional manipulation that Rick employs with Morty is particularly sophisticated because it exploits the natural developmental needs of adolescents for mentorship, adventure, and validation from respected adults, while also taking advantage of Morty's social isolation and low self-confidence to create dependency that serves Rick's emotional needs rather than promoting Morty's healthy development and autonomous decision-making capabilities. The mixture of genuine care and calculated exploitation creates psychological conditions that make it extremely difficult for Morty to distinguish between authentic expressions of love and strategic behaviors designed to maintain his posing, compliance, and emotional availability. The family dynamics that Rick orchestrates through his individual relationships with each family member create overall household conditions that serve his need for control and validation, while preventing other family members from developing the kinds of mutual support and independent relationships that might challenge his authority or provide alternative sources of emotional security and decision-making guidance. The conflicts and dependencies that he fosters between different family members ensure that his role as mediator and problem solver remains essential, while also preventing the development of family cohesion that might function effectively without his constant involvement and oversight. The isolation techniques that Rick employs to maintain his central role in family dynamics include systematic interference with external relationships and activities that might provide family members with alternative sources of support, validation, or perspective on their family situation. The adventures and crises that regularly disrupt normal family routines serve to prevent the development of stable relationships with friends, colleagues, and community members who might offer different perspectives on Rick's behavior, or provide support for family members who might otherwise resist his influence or seek help in addressing problems he has created. The normalization of chaos and crisis within the Smith household creates psychological conditions that make family members dependent on Rick's crisis management capabilities, while also preventing them from developing the stability and routine that healthy personal development requires over extended periods. The constant state of emergency that characterizes their family life makes it difficult for anyone to maintain long-term goals or commitments that might conflict with Rick's immediate needs or preferences. creating ongoing conditions that prioritize his emotional security over everyone else's developmental needs and personal aspirations. The philosophical frameworks that Rick promotes within his family relationships serve to justify his manipulative behaviors, while also undermining other family members' confidence in their own moral reasoning and emotional responses to situations that would normally provoke resistance or calls for external assistance. The nihilistic worldview that he presents as objective truth about the nature of reality actually functions as psychological conditioning that reduces family members' capacity to maintain hope, purpose, and investment in relationships and activities that might provide alternatives to their current family dynamics. The technological solutions that Rick provides for family problems consistently serve to increase rather than reduce dependency on his continued involvement, while also preventing family members from developing the problem-solving capabilities and emotional resilience that would enable them to address difficulties through their own resources and mutual support. The devices and interventions that he presents as helpful assistance actually function as methods for maintaining his essential role in family operations while preventing the development of autonomy and self-confidence that would enable family members to function effectively without his constant oversight and management. The competitive dynamics that Rick fosters between family members serve to prevent the development of alliances and mutual support that might challenge his authority, while also ensuring that his approval and attention remain valuable, resources that family members must compete to obtain rather than sources of security that enable independent growth and development. The scarcity of genuine validation and emotional support that results from these competitive conditions makes family members more dependent on Rick's intermittent positive reinforcement, while also more tolerant of ongoing manipulation and emotional neglect. The long-term effects of Rick's systematic manipulation of family relationships create psychological damage that extends far beyond immediate issues of control and dependency to encompass fundamental problems with trust, intimacy, and emotional regulation that affect every aspect of family members' personal development and capacity for healthy relationships with others outside the household. The patterns of manipulation and exploitation that they learn to tolerate within their family context become templates for understanding and accepting similar treatment in other relationships, creating ongoing vulnerability to further manipulation and abuse throughout their lives. The tragedy of Rick's corruption of family bonds extends beyond immediate harm to individual family members to encompass his own psychological isolation and emotional impoverishment, as the relationships that should provide mutual support and genuine connection become elaborate performances designed to manage his anxiety and validate his superiority, rather than sources of authentic love and meaningful human connection. The family that he has constructed through manipulation and control cannot provide the emotional fulfillment and security that he desperately needs, creating ongoing cycles of escalating control and increasing isolation that serve no one's genuine interests or developmental needs. The ultimate irony of Rick's weaponization of family love lies in its systematic destruction of the very relationships and emotional experiences that had originally motivated his scientific pursuits and technological achievements, demonstrating how the pursuit of control and validation through manipulation inevitably corrupts the values and connections that make such control seem desirable in the first place. The man who had once been willing to sacrifice unlimited power for the sake of family relationships had become someone whose need for family validation required the systematic destruction of authentic family bonds, creating hollow substitutes that provided neither genuine security nor meaningful connection for anyone involved in the elaborate deception. The final reckoning: what evil wins? The moment when Rick Prime's body finally hit the floor of his interdimensional stronghold marked not the triumphant conclusion of a decades-long quest for justice, but rather the beginning of Rick C-137's confrontation with the devastating emptiness that follows the completion of goals that have consumed entire lifetimes in their pursuit. The silence that filled the laboratory where Rick had finally achieved his revenge was not the peaceful quiet of resolution, but the hollow absence of purpose that accompanies the elimination of motivations that had provided structure and meaning to existence for longer than most conscious beings experience total lifespans. The man who stood over his enemy's corpse discovered that victory felt indistinguishable from defeat, that the completion of his life's work had eliminated the only source of direction and significance that had sustained him through decades of systematic violence and moral compromise. The physical act of killing Rick Prime with his bare hands had been intended to provide the emotional catharsis and psychological closure that technological solutions could never deliver, but the intimate violence only served to highlight Rick's complete transformation from the grief-stricken family man who had originally sought justice into someone capable of deriving satisfaction from prolonged torture and murder. The blood on his hands was not just evidence of his enemy's destruction, but also proof of his own moral annihilation, demonstrating that his quest for revenge had successfully converted him into exactly the kind of monster who might casually drop bombs through portals into strangers' garages without consideration for the innocent victims whose deaths would serve no purpose beyond inflicting psychological pain on targeted enemies. The recognition that Rick Prime had been fundamentally correct about the inevitable outcome of their conflict created psychological wounds that exceeded anything that physical violence could inflict, forcing Rick to acknowledge that his entire identity as victim seeking justice had been carefully orchestrated fiction designed to transform him into a weapon in Rick Prime's broader campaign of cosmic-scale entertainment and validation. The decades Rick had spent believing himself to be the hunter in their multiversal game were revealed as periods of manipulation, where he had actually served as unwitting collaborator in his own corruption, pursuing goals that served Rick Prime's psychological needs, while believing himself to be acting according to independent moral principles and personal agency. The aftermath of Rick Prime's death was characterized by the complete absence of the satisfaction, relief, or sense of completion that popular narratives about revenge typically promise to victims who successfully eliminate their tormentors. Instead of experiencing emotional healing or psychological closure, Rick found himself confronting the reality that his enemy's elimination had removed the primary source of structure and meaning from his existence, without providing any replacement purpose or direction that seemed worth pursuing. The goal that had organized his understanding of himself and his place in the multiverse was gone, leaving behind only the accumulated weight of his choices and the growing awareness that the person he had become bore no meaningful resemblance to the man who had once deserved the love of a good woman and innocent child. The philosophical implications of Rick Prime's final words created ongoing psychological torture that no amount of physical revenge could address or resolve, forcing Rick to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of his transformation and the extent to which his quest for justice had actually been elaborate exercise in becoming the very thing he had originally sought to destroy. The recognition that he would indeed have been Rick Prime under different circumstances eliminated any remaining sense of moral superiority or justified anger that might have provided continuing motivation for existence, leaving him face to face with the reality that his greatest enemy had simply been an alternate version of himself, who had made different choices about how to respond to similar capabilities and opportunities. The absence of external validation or recognition for Rick's achievement in eliminating Rick Prime highlighted the fundamentally personal and meaningless nature of their conflict within the broader context of multiversal affairs, and B, cosmic significance. The universe remained completely indifferent to Rick's victory, offering no acknowledgement that cosmic justice had been served, or that the elimination of Rick Prime represented meaningful progress toward any larger goals or purposes that might justify the suffering and destruction that had accompanied his decades-long campaign of revenge. The silence that greeted his triumph was more devastating than any defeat could have been, confirming that his life's work had been elaborate exercise in personal psychology rather than meaningful contribution to the welfare of conscious beings throughout the multiverse. The technological capabilities that Rick had developed during his hunt for Rick Prime remained available, but now lacked any clear purpose or application that could provide replacement meaning for the goal that had been eliminated through Rick Prime's death. The weapons systems, surveillance technologies, and analytical frameworks that had once served his quest for revenge now seemed like monuments to wasted potential and misdirected brilliance, representing years of intellectual achievement that had been channeled toward destructive rather than constructive purposes. The same capabilities that had enabled his transformation into a cosmic-scale threat could potentially be redirected toward positive goals, but Rick's psychological state following his victory made it difficult to envision or pursue such alternative applications. The family relationships that Rick had maintained during his years of hunting Rick Prime were revealed as elaborate performances designed to provide emotional stability and practical support for his revenge mission, rather than authentic connections based on mutual love and genuine concern for each other's well-being. The recognition that his interactions with Beth, Morty, and other family members had been systematically corrupted by his underlying obsession with eliminating Rick Prime created new forms of guilt and self-recrimination that exceeded anything he had experienced during his most violent and destructive periods. The people he claimed to love had been unknowing accessories to his transformation into a monster, their affection and trust exploited to maintain his psychological equilibrium while he pursued goals that served no one's genuine interests. The memory of his original family and the love he had once felt for Diane and Beth became increasingly painful, rather than comforting following Rick Prime's elimination, as Rick was forced to acknowledge that his response to their deaths had dishonored their memory and violated every value they had represented during their brief time together. The man who had once chosen family over power had become someone whose pursuit of revenge had systematically destroyed his capacity for the kind of authentic emotional connections that had originally made life worth living. The victory he had achieved was simultaneously vindication of their deaths and ultimate betrayal of everything they had meant to him during their shared existence. Evil Morty's role in Rick Prime's final defeat created additional layers of psychological complexity and humiliation that prevented Rick from experiencing his victory as purely personal achievement, forcing him to acknowledge that his success had depended on assistance from someone whose capabilities and strategic thinking exceeded his own in crucial areas. The recognition that he could not have defeated Rick Prime without help from a being he had systematically underestimated and mistreated created new forms of self-doubt and inadequacy that undermined any sense of accomplishment or validation that might have accompanied his enemy's elimination. The victory belonged as much to evil Morty as to Rick himself, highlighting his limitations and dependencies rather than confirming his superiority. The broader implications of Rick Prime's death for interdimensional stability and security remained unclear and potentially problematic, as the elimination of one cosmic-scale threat did not address the underlying conditions that had enabled such beings to emerge and operate without meaningful opposition or accountability. The technologies and knowledge that Rick Prime had developed remained available for potential exploitation by other individuals or organizations that might pursue similar goals through comparable methods, creating ongoing dangers that Rick's personal victory had done nothing to prevent or address. The success of his revenge mission had eliminated one threat, while leaving intact the systemic problems that made such threats inevitable. The question of what Rick should do with the remainder of his existence became increasingly urgent and impossible to answer satisfactorily as the immediate aftermath of Rick Prime's death gave way to longer-term confrontation with purposelessness and meaninglessness that no amount of technological capability could resolve through conventional problem-solving approaches. The same intellectual abilities that had enabled him to develop weapons capable of eliminating cosmic-scale enemies were inadequate for addressing questions about meaning and purpose that transcended technical challenges and required emotional maturity and philosophical wisdom that Rick had systematically destroyed in himself during his transformation into an instrument of revenge. The alcohol consumption and emotional withdrawal that had characterized Rick's behavior during his most difficult periods became more frequent and intensive following Rick Prime's death, as he sought chemical solutions to existential problems that no amount of scientific knowledge or technological innovation could address through direct intervention. The substances he used to numb psychological pain and philosophical anxiety served as temporary escapes from confrontation with questions about identity and purpose that had no clear or comfortable answers. But they also prevented him from engaging constructively with the challenges of rebuilding meaning and direction in existence that no longer revolved around clear enemies or definable objectives. The family members who had supported Rick during his hunt for Rick Prime were left to deal with the psychological aftermath of his victory without adequate preparation or understanding of how fundamentally the completion of his quest would alter his personality and capacity for normal relationships. The man they had known and adapted to during his years of focused pursuit was being replaced by someone whose emotional availability and investment in family dynamics had been permanently altered by the elimination of his primary source of motivation and identity. The relationships they had built with revenge-obsessed Rick were not easily transferable to post-victory Rick, creating ongoing tension and confusion about how to maintain family connections with someone whose psychological landscape had been fundamentally transformed. The legacy of Rick's campaign against Rick Prime extended beyond immediate personal consequences to encompass broader questions about the nature of justice and accountability in contexts where unlimited technological capability made conventional legal and moral frameworks inadequate for addressing crimes that transcended normal categories of violence and destruction. The precedent that Rick had established through his successful elimination of a cosmic-scale threat created expectations and permissions that might influence how future victims of similar crimes approached questions of justice and revenge, potentially encouraging other individuals to pursue comparable campaigns of multiversal violence rather than seeking institutional solutions or community support. The scientific knowledge that Rick had accumulated during his decades of hunting Rick Prime represented information that could potentially contribute to beneficial projects and humanitarian goals, but his psychological state following victory made it difficult for him to envision or pursue applications that would require sustained emotional investment and moral commitment to purposes beyond immediate personal satisfaction. The same capabilities that had enabled systematic destruction could theoretically be redirected towards systematic construction and healing, but such redirection would require forms of hope and purpose that Rick's successful revenge had eliminated rather than provided. The philosophical questions that Rick Prime had raised during their final confrontation continued to haunt Rick long after his enemy's death, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of identity and moral development that no amount of rationalization or intellectual analysis could adequately address or resolve. The recognition that circumstances, rather than fundamental character differences, had determined their different paths created ongoing uncertainty about his own moral worth and the authenticity of any positive changes he might attempt to make in his approach to relationships and responsibilities. The possibility that he remained fundamentally the same person who could become Rick Prime under different conditions made genuine redemption seem psychologically impossible. The empty victory that Rick had achieved through eliminating Rick Prime served as ultimate demonstration of how the pursuit of revenge inevitably corrupts its practitioners, regardless of the justice of their original grievances or the sophistication of their methods and capabilities. The decades he had spent transforming himself into someone capable of matching Rick Prime's cruelty and effectiveness had succeeded in their immediate objective, while simultaneously destroying everything that had originally made such success seem desirable or meaningful. The man who had won his war against cosmic evil had become indistinguishable from the enemy he had defeated, achieving hollow triumph that provided neither satisfaction nor purpose for whatever remained of his existence. The recognition that evil Morty had ultimately proven more successful than either Rick in transcending the limitations and corruptions that had defined their conflict created additional humiliation and inadequacy that highlighted Rick's failure to grow or develop beyond the psychological frameworks that had trapped him in cycles of violence and revenge. The being who had suffered most from Rick's psychology had also demonstrated the greatest capability for moving beyond its limitations, escaping entirely from the dimensional prison that Ricks had constructed around their own egos, while leaving Rick himself still confined within systems of thought and behavior that prevented authentic growth or meaningful connection with others. The final irony of Rick's victory over Rick Prime lay in its confirmation that winning had always been impossible within the terms that Rick had established for their conflict, since success required him to become someone whose values and methods were indistinguishable from those of his enemy, while failure would have meant allowing Rick Prime's cruelty to continue unchallenged across infinite dimensions. The choice between becoming a monster and permitting monstrous behavior created false dilemma that eliminated possibilities for growth, healing, or redemption, while ensuring that all outcomes served Rick Prime's broader goal of demonstrating the inevitable corruption that accompanied exposure to unlimited power and cosmic awareness. As Rick stood in the aftermath of his greatest achievement, surrounded by the technological marvels that had enabled his transformation from victim to victimizer, he was forced to confront the reality that his quest for justice had succeeded in every technical sense, while failing completely in every human sense that mattered. The victory he had achieved was simultaneously complete and meaningless, demonstrating that some forms of winning were indistinguishable from losing, and that the pursuit of revenge inevitably destroyed everything worth preserving about the people who undertook such journeys, regardless of how justified their anger or sophisticated their methods might appear to external observers. And so we reach the end of our journey through the most disturbing corridors of Rick and Morty's infinite multiverse, where genius becomes curse and love transforms into weapon. These tales of cosmic horror remind us that in a universe of infinite possibilities, suffering too becomes infinite, echoing across dimensions where every choice leads to pain and every solution creates greater problems. Perhaps the most disturbing truth revealed is not the existence of monsters like Rick Prime or evil Morty, but the recognition that ordinary people, loving fathers, curious children, brilliant scientists can be transformed by trauma and power into instruments of unimaginable cruelty. The multiverse offers infinite chances for redemption, but also infinite opportunities for corruption. As you drift towards sleep, remember that unlike Rick, you exist in a single reality where choices carry weight, relationships have meaning, and the simple act of choosing kindness over cruelty can echo through generations. Rest peacefully knowing that in this dimension, love need not be weaponized, intelligence need not corrupt, and even the most broken souls can choose healing over revenge. Sweet dreams in this beautiful, singular, irreplaceable universe where hope remains possible.